Today's bonus federal election episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We partner with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train and develop leaders to build power from within their community. And in 2022, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories and inspire others, take action and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also proudly brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Are you highly organised? I love people who are organised and love working in a fast-paced environment. Maurice Blackburn, Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, is looking for an executive assistant to support their deputy CEO for a 12-month fixed-term contract based here in Melbourne. This will include coordinating and supporting the deputy CEO with high-level administrative assistance, coordinating documents with strong attention to detail, building and managing relationships with key internal and external stakeholders, and providing excellent client service. To apply, simply go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Be part of change and fight for fair. Apply now. Hello and welcome to, as I said before, our bonus episode of Socially Democratic. This is our Battleground, Key Seat, Path to 76 monster podcast where we're bringing together a whole bunch of folks who have got strong actual campaign experience for the Labor Party. They've either been party secretaries, campaign directors, assistant secretaries, national organisers, state-based organisers, have all worked for the machine side of the Labor Party, and they're bringing their skills, insights and resources to this particular campaign where we are going to break down all the key battleground seats, the marginal seats that Labor either need to hold or that Labor need to gain in order to get to that magical number of 76 to form government in the House of Representatives and win this goddamn election. And so we're going to break all of that down in this episode. So we're going to start in New South Wales with Elliot Stein. Then we're going to move to covering South Australia, Tasmania and Victoria with David Feeney. Then we're going to get on a red-eye flight all the way across to Western Australia to talk to Lenda Oshalem. And then we're going to go all the way back across the other side of the country to Queensland to have a chat with my old buddy Linus Power. And we're going to break down all of the key battleground seats that will determine this campaign. We'll talk about the demographics, we'll talk about the history, we'll talk about some of the polling, we'll talk about some of the things we're hearing from on the ground. We'll also talk a little bit about what the odds are in terms of the betting. So if you want to lay a couple of bucks on one or two seats, maybe we'll give you a bit of indication of where you should allocate your financial resources for your, if you fancy a bit of a flutter. So that's today's episode. So it's going to be a long one, but it'll get you through the whole week because there's only 6 days to go until this election is over, and then we'll finally find out who is going to lead our country into for the next 3 or 4 years, and hopefully it'll be an Albanese Labor government. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or your favourite podcast app. Be sure to give us 5 stars on whatever podcast app you use. And to follow us, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Also to remember, we're going to do our final episode with David Feeney and Emma Dawson. We've been doing these weekly recaps of the campaign. We're going to do our final recap, which will come out probably Thursday night. We'll record the episode midway through the day on Thursday, and we'll try and get it up earlier for you folks so you can have a listen to it over Thursday and Friday whilst you're out door knocking, talking to voters. And convincing them to vote for their local Labor candidate, because that is the only thing that's left to do in this campaign. That's the only way that we can be effective and use our voice for changes to make calls or knock doors with targeted, undecided or persuadable voters in target seats. And we're going to list all those target seats in this podcast. But if you want to find out how you can volunteer, simply go to either thisislabour.org/volunteer if you live in Victoria. But if you're outside of the state of Victoria and across the country, you simply go to alp.org.au and put your details down, and one of the field organisers from those local campaigns will give you a call and jump on one of those races. And if you can't go and knock doors and make calls, and donate money, and you can go to alp.org.au and donate whatever spare cash you've got to the campaign. Doesn't matter how late in the campaign, any dollar raised will help support these critical campaigns in these marginal battleground seats right across the country. Okay, let's get to today's monster episode. Okay, we are taping this one on a Friday lunchtime on the land of the Wurundjeri people, but we're actually going to be taping a bunch of episodes over the course of this weekend. As I said in the intro, this is your sort of form guide to election 2022, where we're going to break down a whole swag of seats across the country, and we're going to be speaking to a bunch of people that have campaign experience for the Labor Party. They might be doing different things these days, but they're still heavily involved in politics and campaigning, but they come from a strong campaign experience. They've either been a party secretary or an assistant secretary or a national organiser or a state organiser. And they're going to be breaking down all of these seats with me over the course of this episode. And we're going to start in the Premier State. We're going to start in New South Wales. As Paul Keating said, so where goes New South Wales, so goes the country. So I guess it would be the Ohio of Australian politics. And to help me break that down, we've had Elliot Stein on before, but joining us again from Hawker Britain, Elliot Stein, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
G'day, thanks for having me.
And the last time you were on the show, we did we did a pre Queensland election analysis, which I had a bunch of people reach out to me saying, Stephen, the fact that you had a conversation about the betting odds was super helpful. I didn't realize there were so many gamblers that listened to this podcast, so we've included that in today's episode. We'll talk about odds as well for those who want to put a little bit of a money wager on some of these races. Before we begin, because you're my first guest, let's actually sort of do a state of play of the House of Representatives. There are normally 150 seats in the House of Representatives, but there is a new seat added to the House. There's 151 seats going into the new Parliament. So the number that government is formed on doesn't change. It's still 76 seats. You need 76 seats to win government. As it stands right now, the coalition have 76 seats. Labor has 69, and there's an asterisk next to that because they actually have 68. But the new seat that's been formed is the seat of Hawke in the northwestern suburbs of Melbourne, which is being designated as a notional Labor seat. And they've given, with the way that they've cut the boundaries, it's like a 10% seat to Labor. So instead of Labor having 68, we've got 69 seats, and the crossbench have got 6. So that means we need 6. So we need 7 seats to get to 76 and form government. So let's move into New South Wales. And where do you want to start, Elliot? What seats are... Let's first of all lift up all of the seats do you think that are in play, and then let's deep dive into them. I think you want to start with the Teals to begin with. But what are the seats that you see as right across the state of New South Wales that are up for play in this election campaign?
Great. Well, thanks, and thanks again for having me back. And it's good to see that Punters Caucus has infiltrated and got to your listenership as well. So we'll have to dive into some numbers at the end. There's 3 kind of categories. There's the Teal seats in North Sydney, Wentworth, Mackellar to some extent. Obviously, Warringah's already in the held category for them. There's seats that Labor's on the hunt for in Robertson, Bennelong, Reid, Banks. And there's seats that we need to be defending, Gilmore, Parramatta, Macquarie, and potentially parts of the Hunter region as well in the case of Shortland. So that's the grab bag of seats that I think people need to be keeping an eye on in New South Wales this time around.
Okay, so what we're going to do is, as I'm not going to do a lot of talking, you're the expert on this subject matter because this is your home state, so you know more about it than I do. So I'm just going to basically just, I guess, facilitate the conversation by just giving the listeners a bit of an overview of what the seats look like, and then let you dive in on terms of what either national, state, or local issues are dictating the way that this campaign's shaping up, and what Labor needs to do to either hold or win that seat. But obviously, we'll start with the Teals first of all, which is not where Labor's in play. But I think you want to. It's an interesting topic that everyone wants to talk about. So let's talk about the Teals first. What are the Teal seats that we're going to be diving into here in New South Wales?
So in New South Wales, the Teal seats in particular, Wentworth, North Sydney, Mackellar, and Warringah. So the reason why I wanted to start with those is that those are the most indicative of what Scott Morrison is trying to pull off in this election. He is at risk of losing those seats, and has made a calculated decision of, instead of going after trying to hold on to those seats, he is quite, in my estimation, quite deliberately jettisoning them with an attempt to jump from one lily pad of constituency to another lily pad of constituencies, which is moving from the not quite inner city, but the leafy suburbs of Sydney for outer suburban areas. And he's trying to bargain off seats where his core constituency no longer feel represented by the Liberal Party. I was at a business function this morning and there was somebody talking about putting your customer first. Well, the Liberal Party stopped putting its own base first, basically from 2009 onwards, when they started playing the most divisive form of climate policy possible. And they just had to take the gamble that their own people will continue to hold their nose and vote the ticket. Well, ever since Sally Steggall came along, communities which don't feel represented by the modern Liberal Party have decided that there's an alternative. They've looked around and they've found that in people who better represent them at an individual seat-by-seat level, and that's what we can really see the Teal movement as. So I think in those seats of Wentworth, North Sydney, and Mackellar is the most stark example of where the Prime Minister has just cut those seats loose and gone on the hunt on a values proposition further west. And obviously it goes almost without saying, but the antithesis of that strategy is in the candidate selection for the Liberal candidate in Warringah. As Nikki Savo has reported, a campaign being run out of the Prime Minister's office, separate to the party structure, being done deliberately to whistle and appeal to voters in seats outside of there, and in doing so, quite relaxed about the fact that he is jettisoning parts of the party which don't agree with him. So I think there is a potential in this election for the most fundamental realignment of the electoral map. Really, well, not just in the modern era, but you could go back to 1909 and the fusion. This is a fundamental reshaping of the map and the sort of constituencies, and there's a bigger, broader lesson in there around how to be a good MP and how to be a good major party around representing the communities that you represent. But right now, for this purpose, it is abandoning those seats and going on the march elsewhere.
Listening to you just talk about this moment, it feels like are we witnessing a historical moment in the realignment of Australian politics, much similar to what happened in the 1960s in the United States, where the Democrats, through the introduction of legislation like the Voting Rights Act, in which they essentially, and I think it was Johnson who said when he signed that, he said, "I'm signing away the South." The Democratic South was basically from that moment on slowly whittled away, but at the same time they started to pick up seats in the Liberal northeast and sort of what is now the modern Democratic Party. I mean, are we witnessing history right now in which we're seeing the Liberal Party throw away its intellectual inner city base for this new proposition? And how does Labor then deal with that? Because I mean, we've always been juggling this sort of this community of or coalition of interest within our broad church, which has been the sort of the traditional blue collar, outer suburban, migrant, Catholic, working class base. But then since Whitlam, we had this sort of academic, intellectual, inner city group as well, and we've been trying to balance these two, and I think we've done a reasonably good job of it. I mean, what implications is this for Labor, do you think?
Yeah, and I think that that analogy is the right one. I've heard some people talking about, the '96 Howard Battler election, for example, or the Boris Johnson Red Wall strategy more recently around Brexit. I don't think those two are analogous because they were sort of yes and propositions of taking your existing bag of seats and going and breaking into territory which you previously hadn't because of a particular issue, Brexit, for example. This is trying to do about 10 years worth of electoral realignment in one bite, in one go, whilst you've still got your ankle tethered to one set of seats while trying to jump over to a new set of seats. And I think that's why he's sort of falling in between the two. So yes, I do think it's a really fundamental realignment. What implications it had for us? What I've been thinking about recently is the idea of having strong community independence. And this time around, they are predominantly running in either Liberal or National seats. because there's some other ones which we won't get to today, like Hume, for example, where there's a great community independent campaign running down there against Angus Taylor. But there's no reason why those sort of campaigns couldn't come against Labor seats. And so I think the message and the lesson for us is about having good candidate and MP selection, having people who represent and are reflective of their communities and are in touch with their communities, and overall having a policy mix which is where the people are, not just responding to fringe elements within your own show or taking a short-term political gain outside of where the community expectations are. And that's why I keep coming back to like the great betrayal of the Liberal Party against themselves on climate change. And so I think that, there's a challenge for Labor, and we've been working through that, I think, over the last 10 or 15 years, and that's particularly acute, obviously, in parts of Queensland federally and other communities, including the Hunter. But I think we're getting that mix right, and I think at the core, we've always kind of understood that who we're there to represent. And even when, which is Labor, organised Labor, working people, but what we've been able to do over our century-long multiple, history is move with the times and keep to that North Star of looking after working people, even when the mix of who is a worker changes.
So do you want to move now to, is that a good segue to talk about Labor and what we need to hold in this situation right now? Because obviously there's a number of seats there you've just listed. You talked about Gilmore, Parramatta, Macquarie. I chucked Shortland on the list anyway because I just want to get your thoughts on that. I'd heard a rumour that we were a little bit worried about Shortland, but maybe it's not the case. But let's talk. Do you want to talk about Gilmore, Parramatta, and Macquarie to start with?
Yeah, absolutely. So as part of the flip side to Morrison's strategy is that he needs to win seats off us in order to offset the losses that he's accepting on Teal Seats. For us, that means we need to be defending Gilmore, Parramatta, and Macquarie. We'll start with Macquarie, and I was up there earlier in the week. That's a real knife edge result. Fantastic local MP in Susan Templeman holds the seat currently by a handful of a couple of hundred votes. I think it's a 0.2% margin or something. So that's a real knife edge sort of one. My anecdotal evidence on the ground was that, and this is sort of reflected across the board, there was not a great deal of ground game from the Libs in that electorate. I think there's a broader story about the state of the New South Wales division of the Liberal Party right now, but for my observation on the ground, that wasn't there. You obviously got Susan, who's got incumbency and particularly through some more recent natural disasters and floods, has been a very active and very good representative of her community. So I'm confident of us being able to retain off the back of Susan's hard work, but that's one to keep an eye on election night, just given how close it is. It's a little bit here, a little bit there, and something odd could happen. But on the basis of hard work, I'm sure that she'll be doing her best to get there. Parramatta is a little bit different. Parramatta, I think, in the Prime Minister's eye, would be that sweet spot of where he would want to be going after. I think he's been there now 5 or 6 times during this campaign. I think it's one of the very few electorates he feels comfortable showing his face in. It's got a very, very popular retiring sitting MP. There was very late candidate selection. Objectively, there was late candidate selection from both sides. In fact, the Liberal Party was even later than us in selecting somebody for a seat which is would be a must win for them. So again, that speaks to the disorganisation, disarray of a show where they could be looking to pick up a seat like this. Very, very, very diverse, very multicultural, but also I think where the cost of living crisis will be feeling most acute, and so. Or it's the sort of seat, I think, where Morrison would be wanting to try to do some of his value proposition arguments, particularly in highly religious communities or other sort of communities. But I think that's coming at a cross with that cost of living crisis as well. That Andrew Chartman's working his butt off. and when I was in Parramatta a few days ago, he's got an amazing science art game, and he is everywhere. He is absolutely everywhere. So he's doing good work there as well. And Gilmore again, a must-win for the Liberal Party. It's one of the few where they got their act together comparatively earlier than other seats. It was late last year, after a very messy tussle between a number of Liberal Party. That's where they've dropped in a former State Minister for Transport, Andrew Constance, who was the state member for Bega. Now, it's worth noting that in the Bega by-election, that Labor picked that up. First time, I think, in New South Wales political history that we've picked up that through the amazing Dr. Michael Holland. And the seat of Bega, which Constance represented, the only overlap there is Batmans Bay. So the seat of Bega goes from Batmans Bay to the border, whereas the seat of Gilmore goes from Batmans Bay to Kiama, for those familiar with for the South Coast. That's a tough one. Obviously, we've got a fantastic sitting MP in Fiona Phillips, but first term MP, and given the high profile nature of the Liberal candidate against her in Constance, and someone who's came to particular prominence, ironically came to prominence by being against Morrison during the bushfires. I thought at the start of the campaign, that effectively we'd both be running anti-Morrison campaigns, but I think Constance has been mugged by reality and had to fall into line. And there is there is both positives and negatives from everyone in the community knowing who you are, because they know who you are. And for example, Batmans Bay, which was the only overlap between the two seats, had tremendous swings towards Labor at the state by-election. Different issues, different candidates, I'll grant you, but I think the easy run that Constance might have thought he had by getting into federal parliament might not be there for him.
The anger that we saw so openly on the television during the bushfires, albeit a long time ago now, we've had a global pandemic since then, but I'm assuming that it must still resonate heavily amongst voters on the ground. Like, when I look at Gilmore, and I know that it's a tight margin, 2.6% Labor holds a seat by, and even you look at the betting odds, like it's $1.80 for Fiona and $1.95 for Constance. There's not much in it, but geez, I just imagine, I would assume, and I want to get your sense of what the feeling on the ground, people must be just pissed off at Morrison.
I mean, the world moves on pretty quick, and we've had a bucket load of issues between now and then, but it doesn't move on too quick if you're still living in temporary housing or caravans or whatever, because you've not had the federal assistance that you require to get up off your feet and get back into housing. And when you've got someone who is synonymous with playing ukuleles and going to Hawaii, that would just be resonating very, very strongly. Very, very strongly. Like I said, like the counter to that is that at the time of the bushfires, Constance was as anti-Morrison as they come. I think given that during the campaign, people have seen him do a number of joint appearances and fall into line as a Morrison man, I think would be undercutting any of the advantage that he got from that profile during that period, and they don't forget.
And strategically, it's such a stupid idea. Like, if you're going to put him up, you're thinking, I mean, it makes sense. Okay, let's get the guy that probably is the best insider-outsider that we can possibly run. Then let him be that person. I would say to Morrison, you are not going to Gilmore, and you're never going to stand next to that guy. He's our best chance of actually hanging on to that seat. So let him, let Bartlett be Bartlett. Yeah. Let Constance be Constance. It undermines your strategy.
And look, had they run that, and we don't have the time to get into it now, but if they'd run a purely let Constance be Constance type strategy, I can spend the next hour talking about his failings as a New South Wales Transport Minister, if you like, and how we would have hung that around his neck just as much as well, between trains with doors that go flying off, between ferries that can't operate in the ocean, between ferries that decapitate on the Parramatta River, and light rail with cracks in it, and all of it's coming from overseas. He is not the star candidate.
Brilliant. Love it. Okay, so let's Shortland. Look, as I said to you before, I just wanted to get your sense about the Hunter because it preoccupied our minds for a number of months sort of way back, we had Joel Fitzgibbon having a shit fight with everyone in the Labor Party on the front page of the Australian constantly, and it was like, oh, can we just put a dampener on this? How are we feeling about a seat like Shortland, and broadly speaking, how are we feeling about the Hunter?
Yeah, I've got Hunter in that category of seats that I thought we'd be talking a lot more about, but we haven't. And I've been quite surprised by how little time that Morrison has spent there, given some of the margins, given some of the complex issues that we're managing through in terms of a changing energy mix. But we have done outstanding work with our candidate selection there, the world's tallest man in Daniel. In replacing Joel, and some really good fighters in Pat Conroy and Shortland as well. So I'm confident, and I think the fact that we haven't really been discussing them, we haven't seen much activity there in a meaningful way, shows you where the two majors think that race is as well.
Which is odd, because picking up from the conversation that we just had before about the Teals, if you're trading off seats in a city for this outer suburban thing, surely, the central argument that's undermining the Liberal Party position in the inner city is climate change. So then you double down on the other side of that argument, and that is in the Hunter.
And I think that's where he has tried to, the Prime Minister is trying to do too much of the strategy too quickly. Like the strategy to push into the Hunter, you can't do it at the same time as you're telling Wentworth, Kooyong, Goldstein, and others that you believe in climate change and you're going to get to net zero by 2050, and you hand on heart believe it, and it's true. And then at the other side of your mouth, try to say something different to peel people off Labor in the Hunter. I think. He can't do both at the same time. Even though he's effectively jettisoning and not putting too much effort into them, they're still keeping up appearances. So I think that's part of the failing of the strategy. Or it could just well be that none of this has been particularly well thought through, and we're giving more too much credit. But a bit of that as well.
Before we move on to the seats that we need to gain from the Tories, just want to get your analysis of Gilmore, Parramatta, Macquarie, Shortland in terms of Labor holds. Do you feel confident we'll hold all four?
I do.
Lovely. So we'll mark them all down on our. I'm totalising this across these episodes to keep a track to get to 76. So there you go, folks. You've heard it from Elliot that we are going to hold those four seats: Gilmore, Parramatta, Shortland, Macquarie. Looking at the betting there, just quickly, what kind of money line are we happy there with? Gilmore $1.80. That's probably the best looking, because Pat Conroy is at $1.10. Templeton's $1.14 and Charlton's $1.25. Gilmore, Fiona Phillips, $1.80. That's probably the best looking bet, right?
Yeah, I'm just pulling that up as well. Yeah, of them with the numbers there, Gilmore's probably got the best bit of value sitting in it. But on the basis of those numbers, they all look about right.
Lovely.
But yeah, Gilmore's probably got a little bit of money in there if you want to, offset the lack of the wage rise that the Prime Minister's not giving you.
Exactly. Got to make our money somehow. Okay, let's move to the Tory seats. We've got Reid, Robertson, Bennelong, and was Hughes one as well that we wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I'll talk about Hughes at the end, because it's an award unto itself, Hughes. But Reid, Robertson, and Bennelong are places where, if we are going to make gains from our side, that's where we're going to do it. We've got stellar candidate selection in all three of those seats. Sally Situ in Reid, Dr. Gordon Reid in Robertson, just to confuse your listeners, and the amazing Jerome in Bennelong. I've not had a chance to get on the ground in Reid or Robertson just yet, but I did spend some time in Bennelong earlier on with both Jerome and Senator Ayres, and in the heart of Ryde. Now, granted, Ryde is where Jerome was the mayor. He was a very popular mayor. He's been in public life for 9 years in that community. I saw him working that booth. Everyone knows him. There was a lot of people patting him on the back for putting his hand up of running. And so I think there was a very interesting mood in Bennelong. Something in both Bennelong and Reed and Banks as well. And I want to be very obvious. I'm not an expert in what I'm about to say, but I'll put on the table for those who might be better than me. But I think that they're, anecdotally, and what I've read and seen some fun community polling, a mood shift within the community of Australians with Chinese heritage, or people with Chinese backgrounds or family connections. I noticed it in Banks in Hurstville. I noticed it in Bennelong. I've seen some polling and some sentiment issue tracking, and I think we can sort of imagine the sort of issues and the sort of carry on you've seen from people like Peter Dutton as sitting underneath that. Like I said, I'm far from an expert in that field, and I don't want to overstate it. But I think if there are significant swings towards Labor in those two seats in particular, there'll be a narrative will form after the election around how Morrison treated that community, and you've seen that in their, they're atrocious, but also flip-flopping language around Manchurian candidates and all sorts of nonsense. You've seen them sort of go out there trying to do one thing, realising it wasn't working in another community, pulling it back, trying something else. If there's big swings towards Labor in those parts of the community, in those two electorates, and I think there'll be a narrative formed around what caused that. But in terms of those three, I think Reed and Bennelong are really solid, and potential gains. Robertson's a harder ask, but we've got an amazing person in Dr. Reed there, and if Dr. Michael Holland taught us anything from the Bega by-election, is that good, community-minded, popular local docs do pretty well. So I'll be keeping an eye on him as well.
Elliot, can I ask you here, because the margin that the Liberals hold the seat of Reed is 3.2%. They hold, and so that's, it seems eminently gettable. And Sally Situ looks like a fantastic candidate. And her interview the other day on radio with the Liberal incumbent Fiona Martin just spoke volumes of the intrinsic racism that exists within that political organisation. You just said that you thought Bennelong looks good. And unless my stats are wrong here, Bennelong, I've got it on a Liberal margin of 6.9%, whereas Robertson's only 4.2%. Yet you think that we're probably a slightly better chance in Bennelong than Robertson. What's your thinking behind that?
It's a lot of anecdotal sitting in it. I'll be honest, but having seen how our campaign is running there, the engagement that he's getting within that community, the long tenure of his public life and public service in that community, and potentially the shifting within Australian to Chinese heritage community as well. I think that's a real shot. So I was joking to an audience before in a different context that the good thing about election predictions is that no one ever invites you back on the Monday to tell you that you got it wrong. So I'm going to stick my neck out and say I'm very confident on Reed and Bennelong. Bravo to you for being courageous. All we want is courageous people on this podcast, because I'm the idiot that sat on the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York the day before the 2016 election and gave an interview for ABC Radio back in Australia when they said, who's going to win? And I said, Hillary Clinton is going to shit it in. And, I've never, I just think, fine. I've ran through the streets naked now. I can't get any more embarrassing. Okay, that's great. So Reed and Bennelong are a potential gain for Labor. So let's mark them down. And lastly, you wanted to have a bit of a yarn about Hughes. Talk us through Hughes. Just for the folks at home, it's a Liberal held seat by 9.8%. Jenny Ware's the Liberal. I don't even know about Hughes. She's the incumbent, I'm assuming, right? Not open race. No,
Riley's running against him. $21 for Riley if you want to put some money on Riley. So Hughes, talk us through Hughes.
So Riley's a great bloke and working very, very hard in territory that in other contexts we've all seen campaigns where you don't work as hard. but he is doing great stuff. And I saw him on Monday, and I've said all this to him as well. So Hughes is actually Craig Kelly's current seat. So it is currently held by Craig Kelly, who is now has changed to the United Australia Party. He is running as the UAP candidate and incumbent. Jenny Ware is the Liberal candidate. Very, very, very late pre-selection. If you remember that whole grab bag of seats that were being negotiated between Perrottet and Morrison, Hughes was part of that. There was a tussle over whether a state MP would be dragooned into running and therefore cause a by-election and all that sort of stuff. So a lot of tension there. In the end, they've ended up with Jenny Ware. There's also in that seat a non-Teal community independent, which is an orange candidate. But she's running on issues that would sound very familiar about climate integrity, those sorts of issues, and is running effectively what you'd recognise as a Teal independent, but for colour. And I'm fairly certain she's publicly said she's received money from the Climate 200 movement as well. And then you've got Riley, who is working his backside off. I've never seen someone do so many train stations and letterboxing in seats and margins of that size. He was also a very late pre-selection by us as well. The candidate we had chosen, unfortunately, had some citizenship issues that could not be resolved. If we cast our mind back to a few years ago about the Constitution, which continues to rear its head. So at the very last minute, Riley stepped up to the plate, and so the neighbouring seat is the seat of Cook, Scott Morrison's seat, and Simon Earl there. If you don't follow him on Twitter, is don't speak ill of past candidates, but I've never seen a harder working Labor candidate for Cook in recent memory. So he is doing amazing stuff over there, and both he and Riley have sort of decided to throw everything they've got at these two seats. So I think, look, the conventional wisdom is that it's a Liberal seat. It will revert to being a Liberal seat, and this is all just sort of colour and movement. There is a scenario you could see where this is a Stephen Bradbury style result, but I can't tell you who Stephen Bradbury is right now in that field. But I think that is one on the night to keep an eye on, because goodness knows how the AEC is going to decide to allocate a 2PP vote on the night. They'll do it between Liberal and Labor, but I think it'd make more sense actually to do it of Liberal versus the Orange Independent, based on I should have known as well. Like this independent candidate has been in the field for 8 months. They've had a campaign. They've got a campaign office opposite the Engadine Macca's, where they run their running their campaign. I drive through that electorate fairly regularly from my place up to Sydney, and from one end of the electorate to the other, it is blanketed in Georgia Steel cornflakes. So weirder things have happened. So keep an eye on Hughes.
That's super interesting. I did some training late last year with some SDA delegates up in New South Wales, and they were the Macca's delegates at the Engadine Macca's. And I said, "How often do you get asked about the story about the Prime Minister?" And they said, "All the time. Like everyone comes in. You can tell who's not the local because that's what they're asking. They're basically coming there because it's like going to Disneyland for political, weirdos."
It's my it's my regular coffee stop. It's where I stop because it's sort of the halfway
mark.
Really? It's the halfway mark between my joint and the city. So. I've been well familiar with the Engadine Macca's drive-through for a long time, and now on the walls of the Engadine Macca's drive-through there is some very pointed Scotty Marsh street art on the neighbouring private buildings. So you get to see a very big picture of Scott Morrison when you're ordering your McCafe flat white.
Fantastic. And from SDA union members as well. It's a heavily organised McDonald's store there as well. So you should say hello to the folks there when you go through next time with you. One thing I did ask you, out of the Teal seats, which ones do you think that the Tories may drop on election night?
I think both Wentworth and North Sydney
really
will go. Yeah.
Okay, that's huge.
I should add that there is that North Sydney, that Labor's candidate in Catherine Renshaw is working very, very hard and is putting in a real show of a campaign. And I think it's telling that in sort of the Sky News debates in North Sydney, it was a three-person debate with Labor, Liberal, and the and the Climate 200 Independent. But in Wentworth, it was just Sharma versus Bender. So I think that's of note that people are seeing North Sydney as a three-horse race. But as others have pointed out, not a seat we've ever held since Federation, it would seem very unlikely. But that one is shaping up to be a potential three-horse race. But I still think on balance it will go independent.
Interesting. Well, you've heard it there, folks. Chalk down a Labor hold for Gilmore, Parramatta, Macquarie, and Shortland. Potential Labor gain for Reid and Bennelong, and a Liberal loss to the Teals in Wentworth and North Sydney. Elliot Stein from Hawker Britain, thank you very much for coming back on the show again. We really appreciate your insights for today's episode. We wish you luck with your endeavours on election day, wherever you may. Where will you be on election day?
I'll be handing out at the Thurul Library for Alison Burns in Cunningham.
Good man. All right then, we'll talk to you soon.
Wonderful. Thanks, mate. Cheers.
Okay, let's keep this train going, and we're now going to take a look at the states of South Australia, Tasmania, and Victoria. And to help me do that is a bloke that you invited around to come for dinner, and he ends up staying on your couch for the next 6 months. I invited him for one podcast, and now I feel like I'm talking to him every day. David Feeney, welcome back to Socially Democratic. I only spoke to you yesterday.
It's good to be back. Yeah. And, what are we going to do tomorrow?
I know. So we've been charged, well, you've been charged with the job of covering what I'm calling the other states, which is not Queensland, New South Wales, or Western Australia, and that is South Australia, Tasmania, and Victoria. I want to start in your state of origin and the state that I called home for 5 years, South Australia. Now the People's Republic of South Australia, after a great win by Peter Malinauskas and the Labor team over there just recently.
Yeah.
And we're going to look at the seat of Boothby, because that's the seat that we always look at when it comes to the South Australian federal seats. It's the seat of Boothby. And year after year, our friends in South Australia always promise us, this is the year we're going to win Boothby. But the question I put to you, David Feeney, is this finally the year that we're going to win Boothby?
Well, the first thing I'd say in defence of my South Australian brothers and sisters is they've always been very sceptical about Boothby. It's usually people from outside the state who insist we're going to win it. I've always found the locals to have a far more realistic appraisal. But this could be the year, and let me tell you why. Because the last time Labor won Boothby, 1943, Curtin was Prime Minister, launched his campaign in Perth. And the other interesting thing about 1943 was it was a year when the Japanese Imperial Army was on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. So here we are, 2022. Labor's launched its campaign in Perth. And once again, thanks to Liberal ineptitude, there is a potential enemy in Guadalcanal. Maybe these factors will have cosmic influence. But there are some more fundamentals you'll be pleased to hear. It's a retiring MP. And previously in Boothby, when the MP has retired, as Southcott did in 2016, that has meant that the Liberal campaign and Liberal vote in that seat has suffered. So the fact that the MP is retiring is good for Labor. It was, interestingly enough, in 2019, the only seat to swing to Labor in South Australia. But that is a little bit of a misnomer, because while there was a 1.1% swing in two-party preferred terms, in fact, Nicole Flint's primary vote, the Liberal candidate's primary vote, went up by 3.5%. But Labor's only chasing 1.4% on the 21st of May in this seat. And I think there are some interesting possibilities. The Labor candidate, Louise Miller-Frost, is up against new Liberal candidate Rachel Swift, but there is an independent, Joe Dyer, in the race. And it'll be very interesting to see how she goes. She's was a contemporary of mine at Adelaide University. She has gained prominence in recent times thanks to Christian Porter and his travails. And so she will be an interesting force in that campaign. And whatever impact she has, I imagine it will be an impact that works to Labor's advantage. In terms of some of the demographics of the seat, it still looks demographically like pretty good Liberal real estate. 81.5% speak English at home, 65% born in Australia, only 34% of the electorate say they have no religion. So those three sort of rough and ready demographics suggest that it's not obvious Labor country, but it is certainly marginal country. And if the state is swinging towards Labor, and if Joe Dyer is running interference on the Liberal campaign and message, then I think we can have some quiet optimism about Boothby. Last thing I'd say is that, as you and I both know, the South Australian Labor machine is a particularly impressive one, and the same cannot be said of their Liberal opponents. The two main parties in South Australia have had a vast difference in terms of the capacity of Labor versus the divisions and amateurism of the state Liberals. So that makes me suspect that Labor's campaign on the ground is going to be a far better and more targeted operation.
And to that point, our brothers and sisters in the South Australian branch tend to be a reasonably grounded group of individuals. They don't get too carried away with, predictions and feelings about the seat. Normally when you can ask someone over there about how they're feeling, they'll kind of give you a decent answer. And I did text one of our colleagues before the show. I asked them, what are our feelings about Boothby? And they texted me back, lock. So there you go. You've heard it here first. and certainly the money that's being put on these two seats, Labor, Louise Miller-Frost is $1.29, whereas Rachel Swift is $5. So a lot of money's been put into Labor, which suggests that finally this seat is coming back to Labor.
And, it's one seat, but it'll be a big deal for the state. It'll mean there's a 6-4 split between Labor and the Liberal Party in the state, breaking 5-5 lock. Getting 6 out of 10 is a very good effort.
It's a fantastic effort. And in as we're going to discuss across all of these races, not just here in the states that we're going to look at, David, but across the country, it's a knife fight. Between the 2016 and the 2019 federal campaign, the national electorate didn't really move that much. And if we are going to form government, we have to pick up any opportunities, any sort of creases that we can sort of run through that we need to grab. And if Boothby's one of them, then we'll take it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's put. Are we confident about putting Boothby down as a Labor gain for the campaign?
I think I'd describe it as likely.
Okay, I'm putting it as a gain. All right, let's go to Tasmania. And it's 5 federal electorates in on the Apple Isle. The 3 that we're going to look at is Braddon, Bass, and Lyons. Braddon is a 3.1% margin for the Libs. Bass is a 0.4% margin for the Libs, and Lyons is a 5.2% margin for Labor. What do you want to start with in Tasmania, David?
Well, I guess maybe we'll start with Lyons because at 5.2% Labor seat, your first instincts would be that it's a Labor seat and we're going to hold it. Brian Mitchell won it in 2016. But it's not really as simple as that because in 2019, the Liberal candidate was disendorsed in the middle of the campaign for, that curse of modern campaigns, having said something stupid in social media some years earlier. And so Brian and Labor had a pretty easy run in the seat in 2019. So that I worry that 5.2% seat margin is perhaps not as strong as it might appear at first blush. Lyons is a big seat. It's the biggest seat in Tasmania. It sort of sprawls across the Midlands. It's made up of lots of different communities, and so lots of micro economies and lots of micro issues. It's a much easier seat to win if you're an incumbent, and we have that advantage. I think Labor and Brian will hold it. Brian's not getting the donkey vote, which is a noteworthy thing, but it's not going to be the lay-down misère that some might assume it to be.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. Talking to some folks down in Tassie, they feel optimistic about Lions. They were a little bit nervous about it apparently at the start of the campaign, but they've started to calm down, and they're feeling that Lions is a Labor hold. Where do you want to go next?
Well, let's talk about Braddon. Braddon's an interesting seat. I've spent some time in there in previous campaigns with Sid Sidebottom. Braddon is generally held to be good country for the Liberal Party, and we see that in Tasmanian state elections. Sid Sidebottom, however, did have a good track record of winning this seat. I think he won it 4 times, lost it just once. But Justine Key was Labor's candidate who won it back from the Liberal Party in 2016. Then, because of citizenship issues, which I know a little bit about, she was forced to resign and contest a by-election, which she won in July of 2018 and would have broken a lot of Liberal hearts with that victory, but then went on to lose it in the 2019 election, which was a bit of a shock, I've got to say. Having held it in the by-election, I thought she'd hold it in the general. She didn't. There was a 4.8% swing. So the Liberal candidate, Gavin Pearce, was elected in 2019. The seat, not quite as disaggregated as Lions, but still a big seat with lots of different communities in it and lots of different micro issues in it. Logging, for instance, and the logging industry is a factor there. I think this is going to be very, very close. Labor is not getting the donkey vote here. Liberals have incumbency. It is generally held to be the toughest terrain in Tasmania for Labor, although, you know, we have won it. And as recently as July 2018, we've won it. So I think this is a possible Labor gain, but it's going to be right down to the wire, and preferences will be everything.
Yeah, it's I agree with you. It's a tough set. I mean, Tasmania is tough. It's a weird bloody state, and I mean that with love, because there are times where that state just comes home for us, and there are times when it absolutely kicks us in the pants. And I know in 2019, as you said before, we were a little bit shocked about what the results gave us in Tasmania, and it actually kind of undermined. We had some gains in New South Wales, and we kind of traded it for the losses in Tasmania, which was really unfortunate.
I mean, demographically, all of the seats we're talking about, Lions, Bass and Braddon, you know, have quite conservative demographic DNA. They are, you know, 75 to 80% born in Australia. English is sort of 93, 95, 98% spoken at home. People with no religion is generally only a third of the population. So, you know, these communities are very white. They're very culturally conservative, and that makes it sometimes a challenge for Labor, making sure that its messaging in the state is hitting the right note.
Yeah. Chris Lynch, the Labor candidate, is paying $1.65, whereas Gavin Pearce, the incumbent, is $2.10. So that does suggest that someone knows something. There's a bit of money being thrown on the Labor candidate. But like you said, too close to call. I'm going to say it's a Liberal retain for Braddon. I just don't know if we can get over the line. Oh, now see, I say that aloud now. I actually think that maybe we might jag it. We'll come back to that in a moment. Let's hear what your thoughts on Bass before we make some decisions about Tasmania in general.
Well, Bass is generally known as the ejector seat. Nobody gets to win it twice. It's literally changed hands at every election, I think, for the last 8 elections. And so is the current Liberal going to be the first in a long time to win it twice in a row? It's only a 0.4% margin. The seat's really centred on Launceston. I think about 75% of electors are found in Launceston. My pick is that Labor will jag Bass.
Wow.
Because now, I mean, it is often said that you know, the incumbency is a virtue, but that doesn't seem to be the history of Bass. So I think this is one Labor can win.
Yeah, I just don't know which one it is. I'm with you on that one. I think we may win one seat off the Tories in Tasmania. I just don't know which one it is. I'll cede it to you, David. If you think we're going to jag Bass, then let's put Bassdown as a Labor gain, and Braddon as a Liberal hold. All right, let's get on the Tasman, load the car up, and head across Rocky Bass Strait and return to our home state of Victoria, where we've got a bunch of seats we want to look at. We want to look at Chisholm, Higgins, Corangamite, Goldstein, Kooyong, and maybe we were going to talk about McEwen, but I don't think we probably need to now. But let's start with the Labor holds, and let's start with Corangamite, which is the incumbent is Libby Coker. Labor holds it by exactly 1%. So hold it by 1%. What are your thoughts on Corangamite?
Well, Victoria, of course, this time goes up to having 39 seats. I think it's worth making the point the coalition only holds 15 of those. So Victoria is the jewel in Labor's crown with 21, theoretically, if we're winning Hawke, and we will, 22 out of 39 seats, with 1 independent, 1 Green and 15 coalition. So this is a critical state overall for a Labor victory, because in some ways it goes towards offsetting the great LNP advantage that comes out of Queensland. I'm feeling optimistic about Corangamite. Libby Coker is an incumbent and has all the benefits of that. She's got the donkey vote, which is a useful thing when your margin's 1.1%. It is an interesting seat demographically, because it keeps shedding regional districts as it moves closer and closer into Geelong itself. And that's why we see only 63% of the electorate is born in Australia. That's not to say the Liberals aren't giving it a red hot go, at least in terms of they pre-selected well here, I think. Stephanie Asher, an ex-mayor of Geelong, well, in fact, I think, and probably resigned just to contest the seat. I think she was the mayor right up until the campaign. And you know, a credible-looking, credible-sounding candidate. But notwithstanding that, it doesn't look like the Liberals at a central level have decided this is one for them to win. That we haven't seen their central campaign headquarters put a big investment into this seat. And Labor's machine in Geelong, I think, is good and feeling good about Corangamite. So my tip is that Libby Coker and Labor will hold Corangamite.
Yeah, it's an interesting seat. You're right. That point about the seat slowly, its boundary slowly moving in towards that urban part of Geelong, the urban sprawl in the south of the city. Armstrong Creek is a suburb that's just getting bigger and bigger every month, and a lot of people that are living there are folks that have moved from Melbourne who have taken full advantage of the fact that you can now work from home. And they've moved to Armstrong Creek and they're working from home, even though their jobs are in Melbourne, because it's, reasonably priced housing and a great place to raise a family. So there's a lot of people that are moving down there. There probably are Labor voters that are moving into that party electorate, which I think will help Labor and Libby. From my reports on the ground is that the Liberal campaign is it's not non-existent, but it's not strong. Morrison's only been there once. So to support your argument that the central campaign really isn't investing in Corangamite, is only bodes well for Labor. And the reaction certainly on the doors is it's not overly negative towards Labor. They said it was a bit of a knife fight in 2019.
Yeah, for sure.
A lot of
the Liberals put a big effort in then.
They did. I mean, it was an incumbent. It was, at the time that was the seat that they held. So to win it in the election campaign was amazing, and hopefully incumbency will support the Labor candidacy this time around. So I think I'm with you. I think Corangamite is a hold for Labor, and so do the punters, $1.25 for Libby Coker and $3.65 for Stephanie Asher. So that doesn't look great for the Tories in Corangamite. Quickly, I just want to talk about McEwen. My apologies. McEwen, held by Rob Mitchell. I worked on Rob's campaign when he won it in 2010. I think Stephen Conroy sent me in there just to say, get that bloke knocking on doors and making calls. So I was like Tony Liberatore. I placed a tag on Rob for 5 weeks. He's a great bloke. I love him. It was one of the best campaigns I've ever worked on. It was a lot of fun. But yeah, I must admit, sometimes getting Rob to just sit down and go through his call list was one of the greatest challenges of my job as a campaigner. Rob holds it by 5.3% at the moment. Early in the campaign, I think there was a bit of worry about McEwen, but I think people have calmed down now and they're feeling reasonably good about it. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on McEwen yourself, David?
Listen, I think Labor's going to hold it. There was concern about it. As you say, Rob's held it since 2010. And on his watch, the seats only got better and better for Labor, aided, I might say, by redistributions. But, Rob's a big personality, and whatever flaws he has, he's got one thing in spades, and that's charm. He's a fun guy to be around. And that gets you a long way when you're fighting in a marginal seat, particularly a marginal seat like this one, which has several communities of interest in it, and an MP needs to be across and networked into all of those. Conversely, that makes it a tough seat to attack from the outside. So the Liberals have got their work cut out for them here. Their One Nation vote here is 6%, and I think that's an interesting number. That's a big number for Victoria, and it speaks to the fact that those outer suburbs that are growing and bleeding into the seat are under a lot of cost of living pressure. They've struggled through lockdown and mandates. There's anger out there. I'd expect Palmer to pick up a decent vote here. So Labor's base has been battered by the pandemic, by mandates. But notwithstanding those challenges, I'm confident that Labor will win this seat.
Okay, let's $1.18 for Rob, and the Liberal candidate's $4.50. So there you go. I wouldn't bother putting any money on that one. Okay, let's go. What do you want to go next, Chisholm or Higgins?
Well, I don't mind. Both of them are interesting seats.
Well, why don't we start with Chisholm, because that's one of the most marginal seats in the country.
Yes, at 0.5%. And this is an interesting slice of eastern suburbs Melbourne because it is very diverse. Only 49% speak English at home. Only 44% were born in Australia. 32% say they nominate that they have no religion. As we know, big Australian community here of Chinese heritage, although what constantly needs to be pointed out, that's a diverse heritage. That's Hong Kong, that's Taiwan, that's mainland China, that's all kinds of different circumstances that sort of make Australia home, but a very diverse electorate. And in 2019, both Labor and Liberal ran candidates of Chinese heritage. Gladys Liu, the Liberal, narrowly won that contest, but she's been in a lot of trouble since. And Labor launched a campaign ad against her early in this election campaign, which pointed all of those travails out. And it was a controversial ad, but I think utterly justifiable one. Gladys Liu is benefiting from the donkey vote in this contest, but I don't think that's going to be enough to save her. So this is going to be a knife fight. It's going to be very, very close, but I would not be surprised at all to see Labor pick this up. I think Gladys Liu has become a negative for the Liberal Party. She has got baggage, and that baggage is understood in her electorate, and it hurts her. And I think she's also undermined by the dramatic, provocative rhetoric that comes out from this government concerning the Chinese Communist Party, because they often make the mistake of just talking about China and Chinese rather than disaggregating the Communist Party and President Xi from the 1.4 billion people who are obliged to be ruled by him. So there will be a whole lot of sensitivities going on in this electorate, and they don't play well for Gladys. So I think this is a Labor game.
The Labor candidate is Karina Garland, former organiser for the NUW and Assistant Secretary of Victorian Trades Hall Council. She's paying $1.40. Gladys is out to $2.80. And
it should be said, PhD, academic career as well. Very bright woman.
Talking to some folks on the ground in Chisholm who have knocked on I think the statistical term is a fuckload of doors. We'll tell you that, and I haven't gone out to the campaign this year, but most years I've certainly spent 2 or 3 weekends knocking on doors in Chisholm, and I can tell you in previous 2013, 2016, 2019, it was tough going. Going into those reasonably, Chisholm's a wealthy electorate, a lot of retirees with a lot of money. And knocking on those doors or making calls into that electorate during those previous campaigns was hard going. People were very, very suspicious of Labor. They were concerned about Labor's policies around negative gearing and franking credits. And this time around, what I'm hearing on the doors is that people hate Scott Morrison. In particular, women voters hate Scott Morrison. The very first question that a lot of people are asking when they knock on a door and they're speaking to a woman voter, what are your opening question? What are your thoughts about Scott Morrison? And then they just unload. They just absolutely unload. And this is in wealthier parts of the electorate. And even talking to people who are normally rusted on libs, you can see there's a nervousness, there's a shifting of the feet about the prospects of their party in this election. So I think here is an opportunity for Labor to actually take back a seat that was held for a long, long time by Anna Burke. And it was huge when Anna first won it in a by-election, I think, a long, long time ago.
And I mean, notwithstanding the fact that she had a long and distinguished career in the seat, it was always very marginal territory. Yep. And every one of her victories was a triumph.
Absolutely. Scott Morrison is there today, so that indicates I guess the Central Campaign's attitude towards Chisholm. They know that they need to hold this if they're going to try and form government. So
we also know that they can't send him to Higgins or Goldstein or Kooyong. So his travelling itinerary is severely curtailed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a Labor win for Chisholm. I think we're finally going to get that seat back after a couple of attempts. So let's put that down as a Labor gain. Okay, let's go to Higgins. Katie Allen is the incumbent. Labor, the Liberals hold it by 3.7%. It is. I'll let you do the history of Higgins because it is blue ribbon territory for the Liberal Party.
Well, it's never been anything other than Liberal, absolute heartland, and of course was Costello's seat, the former Treasurer, and has been a whole lot of Liberal luminaries. For those of us on the sort of machine side of Labor politics, the Liberals' Higgins 200 Club was always a nice big earner for our political adversaries. So it was a place from which they derived a lot of organisational power. Had a lot of Melbourne's blue bloods in their party branches, raised a lot of money, delivered big results to Liberals, and was always held to be a seat that sent only, key front benches to Canberra. So the fact that it's in play is absolutely remarkable. Its margin is now 2.6%. It's lost 1% on the recent redistribution. Katie Allen, the Liberal incumbent, she was, you might remember, the Liberal candidate for the state seat of Paran in 2018. She then won the seat in 2019 and went federal. What's interesting to me about this seat is it should really be a three-cornered contest between Liberal, Labor and Greens. The Greens were the principal adversaries for the Liberals there in 2019, with the Greens putting in a very big effort. But this time it doesn't seem to be quite so. And we might perhaps talk a bit about the Greens, but or more particularly, where are they? But this is really turning into a Labor versus Liberal contest. The Greens will be significant and crucial to the result, but I don't see them coming first or second. And so that is of itself very significant. I think the other thing here is Labor's candidate, Dr. Michelle Anadaraja, is an outstanding candidate. I've done a bit of work in this seat, funnily enough, and spent some time with her, and I am really impressed with her. She is a first-class act. And as an expert in infectious diseases at the Alfred Hospital, she's kind of got a skill set which is rather useful in the current pandemic context. So a good candidate and a big campaign. And Labor really does sniff something going on here because Higgins has turned into an effort which I've never seen before. Labor is investing people and money, has pre-selected well and is lunging for it. And I think that is quite remarkable. It's obviously audiences moving away from from Scott Morrison in particular, and from his rhetoric around issues like women, corruption, ICAC, climate change. All of those things are turning these high education, high income voters with post-materialistic concerns off the Liberals. It's hurting them everywhere. It's hurting them in Higgins. So I think, I don't know what's going to happen in Higgins. I literally think it's going to be a toss of a coin. Will the Green preferences flow to Labor? with enough strength, north of 85%, to deliver a Labor victory? Is Labor's primary vote going to be high enough? Lots of don't knows. But the fact that the Liberals are fighting for their lives in this seat is of itself incredible.
Yeah, to the first point that you raised there, that it has historically been, in most recent elections, that area has been a three-way. You're right. The state seat that mirrors similar boundaries to Higgins, which is the seat of Paran, in the last two election cycles has been a three-way cornered contest between Labor, the Greens, and Liberals. And the vote difference between Labor and the Greens has been a handful, and at the moment Labor has been slightly behind the Greens, which has meant that the Labor candidate had been eliminated and the preferences have flown to the Greens, getting the Green over the Liberal candidates for the Greens to hold Paran. And you're right, in the last election year, it was a three-way contest in Higgins. Talking to folks in the campaign there, they are not feeling like this is a three-way contest. And one way of finding that out is when you go and knock on doors, you'll inevitably come across someone who was either a persuadable or an undecided Green, Labor or Liberal type voter. And they're not coming up on the doors this time. They're not having that conversation where they're meeting a lot of people who are saying, I'm tossing up between Labor or the Greens, or I'm tossing up between Liberal and the Greens. It's very much has a feel of a traditional red versus blue contest, which is, I think, bodes well for Labor in this situation. The second thing is that...
in 2019, you'll remember the Greens ran Jason Ball, who was quite a well-known figure. He attracted a lot of publicity, free media, and a lot of pizzazz around his campaign. The Green campaign this time just looks like nothing by comparison.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I mean, we watched in 2016 the Greens focus on what was then my electorate of Batman and the neighbouring seat of Wills. And then big efforts in there where the Greens were narrowly defeated in both. And then they just switched both of those off. And in 2019, sailed off into the eastern suburbs of Melbourne with a big effort in Kooyong, a big effort in Higgins, and a big effort in what was then Port Melbourne, or Melbourne Ports. So the question now in 2022 is, where are the Greens? And there's a chance they're all in Brisbane, that all of their money and their mobile battalions are all in Brisbane. I don't know, but there doesn't seem to be a Green operation going on in the state of Victoria of anything like the scale we've seen in previous years.
Huge field operation coming out of the Labor campaign in Victoria into Higgins, the Community Action Network. There are, I looked at, there was a social media post before of a door knock that was happening today. There was 37 shifts in that door knock, just in that particular shift. Now, you times that by how many doors they knock on, that's like close to 1,000 doors that they've just knocked today, which is a huge output for the middle of a week or for a Friday afternoon. That's incredible. And what I'm hearing from the team is that it's one of the biggest campaigns, not just in Victoria, but in the country. And that is remarkable to think about that in Higgins. So there's an old expression within the field program that is, leave it all on the field. And that's what Higgins are doing right now. They are leaving it all on the field in these final weeks of the campaign. So I'm feeling good about, I can't believe I'm saying this, I'm feeling good about Higgins. Katie Allen is paying $1.50, so you think she was a lock, whereas the Labor candidate's $3. I'm putting my money on that. That's my smoky. I think we're going to pick up Higgins. I'm feeling good about Higgins. So we'll see if I'm right or wrong on election day. What are your thoughts? You're going to prepare to make a call on Higgins?
I just can't call Higgins. The idea of calling Higgins for Labor is it's just too mind-blowing. But I do think it's too close to call, and I find that astonishing enough.
All right. Let's go to the Teals just quickly to wrap this up. Kooyong and Goldstein. Which one do you want to start with? Do you want to start with Kooyong, since we're in that kind of part of the country, state?
Well, maybe we'll do them as a job lot. Both of these campaigns are, from Labor's perspective, first-class diversion reactions. Both of them are absolute Liberal heartland. The seats of Robert Menzies, the seat of Kemp and McPhee in the case of Goldstein. It's not just where they haven't just been Liberal seats forever, but it's where their membership is concentrated too. So these are they're sort of spiritual as well as demographic heartlands. So these uprisings in those seats are fascinating. I think that I have no evidence for this proposition I'm about to make, but here I go. I suspect the Liberal Party will hold both of them. I would love to be wrong. We saw a very big effort in Kooyong last time, which was spearheaded by the Greens, who got behind the
solicitor. What's his name?
The barrister Julian Burnside,
yep.
Or as he prefers to be called, His Royal Highness and Excellency Julian Burnside III. Julian Burnside's campaign was a very big one, and he obviously enjoyed preferences from Labor and a range of independents. He failed. Is the rebranding of Josh's adversaries as Teals going to change that dynamic and make a victory more possible? I think it does. I think for Liberal switching voters in Kooyong, it's easier to go Teal than to vote for a Green candidate, even if it is someone like Julian Burnside. But notwithstanding that, I think the Liberals will hang on. But irrespective of win or lose, it has consumed a vast amount of Liberal time and money. And so too in Goldstein. The uprising in Goldstein is perhaps even more astonishing because it doesn't have... Kooyong has been on a long, slow burn as anti-Liberal forces have tried different things and coalesced around different candidates. In Goldstein, it looks just like a combustion, a spontaneous combustion has taken place. In a very short period of time, we've seen the Teal candidate there gain an enormous amount of momentum, marshal a lot of people, and scare Wilson and the Liberal Party down there like they've never been scared in their lives. This is a seat that has been Liberal since it was created. And for it to now be at the scene of this kind of fight is unprecedented. So great diversionary action, consuming a lot of Liberal time and money. I suspect the Liberals will come through the other side with both, but the fact that I can't say that with certainty is incredible. If they lose Kooyong, that obviously has a bigger significance in the sense that the Liberal Party potentially loses a future leader or leader of the opposition.
Yeah, I mean, it would be just from a tactics and a strategy perspective, frustrating not being able to have the treasurer fly around the country and do the work that he would normally do. And I'm sure Josh wasn't aware until this point there's a thing called pre-poll because he has to stand on it now for the next 2 weeks.
While Liberal luminaries visit him there, we saw Peter Costello of Channel 9 spent some time there with him, and Hunt did too. So
Alexander Downer,
there you go. So
they're all coming out of the woodwork.
If you want to meet a famous Tory, pop on down to Josh's pre-poll.
Yeah, absolutely. And Goldstein, the Teal candidate there, Zoe Daniel, former ABC journalist, Washington foreign affairs correspondent. We've had actually on the podcast a couple of times as well. Look, I can tell you that the campaign down there in Goldstein that the Teals are running is a mirror campaign to the Community Action Network. And if you ever want more evidence about why field matters, I don't want to talk up people who are non-Labor candidates, but that's what they're doing. They've built a campaign off the back of a grassroots Marshall Gantt-style community organising program, and it's got them into a position now that Zoe Daniel's paying $1.40 and Tim Wilson's $2.80. So
I thought Zoe's launch in particular was quite incredible. I mean, it looked to me like 1,000+ people wearing her T-shirts and chanting her name. That was, and then by contrast, the poor old Liberal launch didn't look nearly as energetic.
No, it's huge. So I think out of the two that can, if I could think of one that will be jagged by the Teals, I would actually put my money on Goldstein rather than Kooyong. I think Frydenberg will probably get over the line, but I think Tim Wilson's days in Parliament are done. That's it, David. We've come to the end. And to summarise, I think we've got a Labor hold in Lyons, a Labor gain in either Bass or Braddon in Tasmania. We've got a Labor gain in Boothby. We've got a Labor gain in Chisholm. We've got a Labor hold in Corangamite and McEwen. You and I can't agree on Higgins. I think it's going to be a Labor gain. You've got it too close to call. And I don't think we really have any sort of strong views on Kooyong or Goldstein, but we'll see on the night.
Yes, I mean, I guess the executive summary of all of that is Labor is moving forward, even if not at a ripping pace, but the Liberals aren't. There's no joy for the Liberals anywhere.
No. David, thank you very much for your insights across those three states. I'll see you later in the week for our final election wrap up with yourself and Emma Dawson from Per Capita. And until then,
hasta la vista.
Okay, we're moving to the west, heading to the west for West Coast Cooler. And there's an old ad that's showing my age. Joining me on the line from Perth is an old friend of mine. We go way back. She was a former Western Australian Labor Assistant Secretary when I was an Assistant Secretary for the Vic branch, and she pioneered taking field into WA, which really was a foundation for the election of the first McGowan government. She's now a partner at Seek Newgate and sort of the lead head office person in their Perth office. Lenda Oshalem, welcome back. Oh no, welcome to Socially Democratic, but you and I have done a podcast together before. Hello, good to see you again.
Hi, good to see you. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited. It's my second podcast ever, and the first one was with you.
I'm hoping that we've got some good news coming out of the West in terms of the numbers that we're looking to try and pick up in WA. What I'll do is, just to give you some context, Lenda, we, at the halfway point of this podcast, which I think is going to be a monster podcast, we've already spoken to Elliot Stein in New South Wales, and we've done David Feeney and I have gone through South Australia, Tasmania and Victoria.
Yep.
And these are the seats. So far, Labor is holding the seats that we need to hold. These are the seats that we have agreed that we are going to pick up at this point in time. And this is also good for the listeners out there to sort of do a running tally of where we're at the half. It's half time in the game. Reid and Bennelong are gains for Labor in New South Wales. Boothby, finally, in South Australia, is coming back to Labor. And the gains in Tasmania, David and I couldn't agree on whether or not would it be Bass or Braddon that we would pick up. So we're just going to say it's a one-seat gain in Tasmania. And Chisholm is the gain in Victoria.
Yep.
I got a little excited in yesterday's podcast recording because I then called Higgins. But I think, my head says no, my heart says yes. And I just want us to jag that seat. It's one of those seats that if you win on election night, it's like when we won Bennelong in 2007, it was like an icing on the cake, kind of stick it up and kind of thing. And I just want us to get that seat, Plus the guys at the Community Action Network volunteers in Higgins have done a ton of work. They've poured a lot of time and energy. It also overlaps with the state seat of Paran, which there's been a great effort by the volunteers in that part of Melbourne over multiple cycles, and I just think they deserve this win. It would be nice for them to win that. In fact, I think when you came over in 2014, I think we actually went and made calls in Paran from memory. Is that right? Anyway,
so I want territory there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always want us to jag that seat. But anyway, I've calmed down a little bit about Higgins, so maybe I'll just put that in the. Let's put it in the. Not so sure, but anyway, if we don't include Higgins, that gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seats to this moment. We need to win 7. So no pressure on Western Australia.
Well, look, I think we're open to having the pressure put on us a little bit here this time around. So you haven't done Queensland?
No, Linus, an old colleague of ours, Power, will be how we finish off the fourth quarter. In Queensland. Exactly. So all eyes on the Sunshine State. But look, WA is so critical. Like we're feeling good about Western Australia, right? Talk us through the vibes just generally in WA right now.
There's definitely a swing on in WA, and it's been a pretty consistent trend. So I keep an eye on the Newspoll primary trend over time, and that primary for federal Labor in WA has been quite high for a very long time. So we've got right now it's at 40%, which is up from 29.8, which was the election result in 2019. and the 2PP shows a 2PP swing of about 8%. So that's a really a good indicator that things are on the up in WA. And there's a lot of things at play here. We've got a very popular local premier, Mark McGowan, who's kind of positioned himself a little bit as a kingmaker at this election, and everybody's sort of using him in their materials as well. So there's Liberal Party MPs that are putting out pamphlets of them standing next side by side with Mark McGowan at events as well. So lots of people trying to leverage off the popularity of Mark McGowan, and I think that it's interesting to see how it might play out in terms of locally, and whether it gives people a level of comfort to do what they haven't done before, which is, vote Labor in a federal electorate in big numbers, or whether it gives people permission to vote Liberal because they feel like they've got a state Labor premier who will look after them locally anyway. And so it's interesting to see how it's probably going to play out with his star factor included in the campaign.
Excellent. One thing to say, I do love Mark McGowan, and I think one of my highlights of Mark McGowan, and there are many, election night when he won in the landslide and the cameras were on his home, and he walked out with his wife and the children, and they all loaded into the car, and he drove himself.
I had conniptions watching that as a former party official, thinking to myself, why is someone not looking after this guy and making sure he's well looked after going in? But you could just see that he would be the one who'd just be like, oh, no, there's no need for fuss. I'll go and look after myself. So he's a pretty down-to-earth individual. But what it actually, that landslide, what it actually means is that, so every state seat in every marginal federal seat in WA is held by Labor. So there are, a law of diminishing returns when it comes to the Liberal Party and their resources, but the vibe on the ground is there's a lot of Labor people about, a lot of good Labor activity, a lot of good community action network field engagement and stuff like that. And that is spurred on by the fact that Labor owns almost every pocket of every marginal seat in the seats in Western Australia.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And obviously we're really interested to see how that translates at a federal level. So let's dive into it, shall we? And I think we'll start with the seats that Labor need to hold. First of all, let's be defensive to begin with. And the seat of Cowan. That's
right. It's a 0.9% seat. Won by Anna Lee in 2016. She was there was a very strong negative attack campaign against her in 2016, and she won it kind of against the odds. To the extent where the Libs put out a pamphlet and showed where she lived, which was in the southern suburbs of Perth, and we have a north-south divide here in Perth, and they had an arrow pointing to where she lives in the southern suburbs and said she's not a local. But I think what it was trying to do was play up a little bit more about the fact that she's got, she's Muslim background. She's not a, party apparatchik. She's come from a counter-terrorism expert background. And so against the odds in 2016 and against that kind of negative campaign, she won it, and she won it. It stays as a marginal because it's always been a marginal, and she re-won the election in 2019, and now she's up again. But what's happened this time is the seat of Stirling that's been abolished in the redistribution. Half of that is now in the seat of Cowan, and the former Liberal MP for Stirling, a guy named Vince Connolly, is running as her opponent. So it's, but in the overall scheme of things, when there's a swing towards Labor in WA, I don't think it's at risk, and I don't think it's marginal. Quite the opposite. I think the Liberal candidate that's running, Vince Connolly, look, he's a really smart, good operator, and he's a down-to-earth guy, got a public service commitment to country background, and I really think the Liberal Party made a mistake. They should have run him for a safer Liberal seat because he could have been someone who could have forged their future and a pathway for their future in Western Australia as well.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because if he is such a rich talent and you want to hang on to him, then you're right, you do that. But the fact that they've put him into such a battleground seat says a lot about their concerns in terms of whether they can actually flip this seat.
Yeah, definitely. And I think he's putting up a really good fight, but I do think Anne's well-known locally, very popular, hardworking. She is someone that the locals are quite proud to send to Canberra to fight on their behalf. As a sort of, she's briefed the White House, she's briefed UN, she is overqualified to be a member of Parliament, and she is fantastic at that. And it's a suburbia, suburb, established homes, but pockets of really strong Labor voting areas and young families, and she's got a personal story that is all about her struggle as a single mum, raising kids, and doing it tough and getting through some of the highs and lows of life with her, great attitude, her smarts, and I think the electors in the area of Cowan really do kind of resonate with her personal story as well. So I think she's got it in the bag, but the Liberal Party are putting up a good fight.
We had Anne on the podcast at some stage this whole COVID period. I can never keep track of time when this may have happened, but it definitely happened during COVID. And she's really, really impressive. Even talking to her at the time, I was thinking, and no disrespect to members of Parliament, but I was thinking, why are you doing this job? Like, you should be leading the UN or something. Like, it's remarkable that we've got a talent of her. Of her capabilities actually in the House of Representatives and in the Labor caucus. So yeah, absolutely critical that we hold that seat. So you're calling that as a Labor hold?
That's right.
Just looking at the odds there, Anne's $1.12, Vince Collins $5.50. So it's not.
It's an easy 12 cents.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a shame that they don't do it anymore, where they can do the parlay, or they do what do they call it in Australia, where you can put a multi-bet. You can Cowan into Melbourne Ports, into Kingsford Smith, into, and just build up this huge multi, and then
yeah, that's a good idea for any of the betting agencies listening to this wonderful socially democratic podcast.
They used to, up until like 2007, or I think they stopped it in 2010. People like you and I were, I'm not a gambling person by any stretch of imagination, I have enough vices, but people were doing that, like, doing multis into multis into multis, like 30-seat multis. And I think that the gambling agencies worked out that there were some people who probably knew a little bit more than they
gaming the system. Yeah.
Yeah, and they got rid of that.
But it does remind me of the 2019 early payout from Sportsbet, calling the election for Bill Shorten, which was, quite an interesting thing. I can't remember how much they lost, but I'm pretty sure it was in the order of millions. Was it 2 million?
Yeah, something to that effect.
Yeah, wow.
Anyway, there we go. Well, I don't think that's. Oh, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next week if they try and do that. I think it's more.
I assume they'll take a very conservative approach at this election.
Absolutely. Speaking of conservatives, nice segue. Let's look at the seats that we want to flip from the forces of darkness and evil. And where do you want to start?
Let's start with Swan.
Excellent.
3.2% Liberal held seat. The sitting member, Steve Irons, is retiring at this election, really puts this seat in play. He is a popular local member. Last election, he ran up against Hannah Beasley from Labor, who ran a really solid and strong campaign. And her, of course, her last name makes a big difference and reminds people of their previous federal member, Kim Beasley, who held the seat up until 1996 before he moved to the federal seat of Brand. And so she's got great local pedigree. She ran a fantastic campaign, exceptionally well resourced. And I think because of that, she kept the margin low in 2019 and saw a small swing towards her and towards Labor in that previous election, which really puts this seat in play for Labor at this election. Two candidates, Christy McSweeney for the Liberal Party's got a bit of a media background, bit of Sky News experience, and Zenita Mascarenas, who is the Labor candidate, is a engineer, local girl, young family. She's really is the kind of the true representative of that community, very representative of that community. And you could tell it's on a knife edge. You could tell the Liberal Party are worried because the negative personal attacks against the candidates has started, and there was a bit of dirt throwing in the last couple of days, kind of placing some stories in the media and running out a robo with a negative message against the Labor candidate. So you could tell the Liberal Party are worried. The seat itself is a bit of a mixed bag. I'm currently looking at what's in the seat, which is the area of South Perth. riverside, high-rise, beautiful apartments and large, beautiful old homes. And it goes from that in one part of the seat to large family homes and established homes around the airport in Perth Airport. So it's got a real mixed bag. It is suburbia. It is a place where working families live, as well as people who are a little bit more well off. And so being able to kind of, Swan has always been a big challenge for Labor, because it's being able to kind of straddle the difference between the kinds of voters that are living around that South Perth area and the voters that are living in Forestfield or Belmont and areas that are a little bit lower economically, little bit lower socioeconomic areas. Sorry for that. And so I think because of that, it's a bit of a challenge. But I think, again, just to remember that there is a bit of a anti-Scott Morrison sentiment out there. You could tell the Libs are worried because of the negative campaign, and all that's starting now. But also every state seat in that federal electorate is held, which includes the seat of South Perth. And so there is a real mood for change, a real opportunity out there, and it's marginal enough. And if you think about those news poll results, it's marginal enough to get over the line on the night. And I'm prepared to say that I think it'll get there.
Okay, I mean, that's huge. I think sometimes we just make assumptions based on what the expectations are and the mood broadly across the nation, and we look at a seat like Swan and go, well, if we're going to win, that's a seat we kind of grab. But it's not as easy as that. And you sort of stepped it out in terms of the challenges that we had with the previous election campaign. But 3.2%, that's a sizable amount of votes that Labor's got to pick up in this election. But it sounds like things are tracking in the right direction. If we are seeing Liberal candidates trying to align themselves with Mark Gowan, are we also seeing examples of Liberal candidates trying to distance themselves from the Prime Minister?
Well, I feel like they might be trying to, but it's not coming across as such, because Scott Morrison has spent a lot of time here since the borders open. He's been able to kind of come back and forth 4 or 5 times. So I kind of, I feel like if they were, look, and I've been, to be perfectly honest, I've been on campaigns where you try to push the candidate up first and foremost, and try to remind people that there's a pretty strong local person. No matter what you think about the major parties, there's a pretty strong local person here that deserves backing. But it's really hard if you're a new candidate, not an incumbent, to do so. And so I think they've got no choice but to sort of stand with Scott Morrison where they can, because he's getting the TVs and he's getting kind of the media attention, and it kind of gives you ability to kind of increase your local presence and increase your profile and recognition as well. So, I'd love to be a fly on the wall of the conversation that happens of like, what? He's coming to our seat? What are we going to do about that? But I actually think there's no way they could avoid it. He's the Prime Minister of Australia. They have to stand next to him.
Yeah, it's hard to keep the man at the top of the ticket away from a marginal seat that you need to hold. Okay, so we're calling Swan then. Is that something we're going to put into is that a Labor gain?
I think so, yes.
Okay.
Do you have this sort of like once bitten, twice shy thing? Like, well,
as I said the other day,
I made some big bad calls in 2019. I'm half not prepared to do them again, but there's a lot happening out here, and I think it's on. And so a 3.2% seat with no Liberal incumbent, you're going to have to say it'll fall. It'll go to Labor.
We're really encouraging courage in this particular podcast from our guests, Lenda. So be courageous and be bold.
Sure, you're not recording it or anything, so surely we'll be fine.
And mighty forces will come to your aid. Look, actually, if anyone is interested, put a bet on this one. The Labor candidate's at $3.55, which is like, if you're calling that as a win for Labor, then that's good money, I reckon. I would take that bet.
That is good money. Labor candidate at $3.55. What's the Liberal candidate on?
$1.25.
Really?
Mm.
That's interesting.
See
Cool. I maintain my view that I think it's winnable.
All right, let's move along. Let's go to the seat of Pearce.
Very good. It's a 5.2% seat. Of course, Christian Porter's the former member who's retiring at this election. That's a whole different podcast about a whole other matter. it's the Battle of the Wanneroo councillors out in Pearce, and there's a councillor, Linda Aiken, who's running for the Liberal Party. She's run previously for the state seat of Butler, which covers a big portion of the seat of Pearce, 3 times, and not quite made it over the line on 3 occasions. And John Quigley, and she's run up against John Quigley, who's the Attorney General in Western Australia, and lost 3 times. She's up against Tracy Roberts, who's the very popular local mayor of Wanneroo, who is a bit of a pocket rocket and a straight shooter, and she is someone that the locals absolutely love. Because our council elections, I'm sure it's the same in some other jurisdictions, but are voluntary postal vote elections, and her turnout numbers are huge, and her recognition numbers are huge, and she's embedded in that community, and people know and love Tracy and trust Tracy, and I think that that's going to hold her in good stead for the Fed election, because the seat and the council overlap, really in significantly overlap, I should say. But that being said, Labor's never held the seat of Pearce in my memory, and so it will be a challenge. But the redistribution has tightened up the seat a little bit. So previously, the seat had 2 sort of population centres, one around Yanchep and Butler, and one around Ellenbrook. And Ellenbrook is a massively growing suburb, and they're 2 very different suburbs. One's near the water, one's in a brand new suburb, a dense population, but around the Swan Valley Tourism Precinct. And so it's got a bit of lack of services around it, but the state Labor government's fixing that. But it's got a kind of high population of migrant families and new families and young families, and they're relatively small homes, whereas the beachside suburbs are, as you could imagine, large homes, a little bit more established, new, or people moving to buy their first new home towards from outer suburban inland areas to the coast. And so that old seat is hard to campaign in. A peri-urban swing's got lots of little regional communities in it. And what the redistribution's done is actually put Ellenbrook into Hasler and keep the seat focused a little bit more on the city of Wanneroo. And so that's going to really help Tracy Roberts, who has the high recognition, high favourability rating in the area, and it kind of focuses the seat a little bit more on the same boundaries where she's represented. So I think that a combination of the incumbent not running, and for the reasons that are surrounding Christian Porter's retirement, so incumbent not running, and in such a way. The Liberal candidate who is running is a local councillor, but has run and lost, 3 times. And I think Tracy Roberts is in with a really, really good shot to pick it up this time. So even if the margin is 5.2%, and even though Newspoll is saying, good things coming to Labor in WA, I don't think 5.2% is truly representative of the margin of Pearce now that it doesn't have an incumbent. And that Tracy Roberts is running. I think she brings a good local flavour to it, and I think it's a close one for Labor, but one that will probably fall over the line on the night. Now, what are the betting agencies saying?
I know. I'll reach you out with that one. I should actually just clarify that these odds may have changed since we first did our research, which was on Thursday night. And when they listen to this podcast, then all this money will come in, and these numbers will change again. Yeah. The betting agencies, Lenda, are saying in Pearce that Linda Aiken is at $2.75 and Tracy Roberts is $1.40. Can I just say that they are the 2 most Aussie names that could run for Parliament, Linda and Tracy?
Yes, that's right. And they also would be strongly representative of the area that the electors in the area that they're looking to represent.
Right, okay. Because I was going to ask you, you said there's a bit of migrant influx into that electorate, into that constituency. Are we talking migrants from the UK and South Africa, or are we talking about migrants from other parts of the world?
The migrants would have been in Ellenbrook, and that would have been less so from the UK, and a mixture of sort of Southeast Asia and the Middle East. And But they're now in the seat of Hasluck, which we can talk about in just a moment. But the other migrants that come in around the coastal area are definitely from UK and South Africa. South Africa. Yeah.
And hello to my cousins from Scotland, the Mullins, who are probably listening and live over in that part of the state.
Great people. Good Labor voters.
Oh, absolutely. We wouldn't,
we'll just out them.
Their grandfather or their fathers would turn their grave if they knew they were voting for the Conservatives. So we're calling, are we going to call Pearce as a Labor gain?
Yes.
All right. So that would then put us on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There you go. That's 76 seats. That's government. Let's stop the podcast. Let's go home now. I'll go watch the basket.
That's it. We're done. But can I just ask, have you not counted on losing any seats in New South Wales?
According to Elliot, no. He's feeling confident that we're going to hold Gilmore, Parramatta, Macquarie, and the seats in the Hunter.
Yeah. Okay. That's fantastic.
Isn't it? I think it's wonderful news. I'm really happy about that. We should have Elliot decide all the elections as opposed to...
We don't even need elections anymore because Elliot can just call them and that will be a fair representation of what's happening out there. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, let's just drive home this Labor government victory with a buffer, and let's turn to Hasluck. How are we looking at Hasluck?
Well, Hasluck is a 5.9% seat, and the sitting member is the first Indigenous Australian MP, Ken Wyatt. And Liberal held. And I think, and he's running again. I think this will be a real tough one for Labor to win. But if the swing is on and the campaign is going as well as I hear that it is for the Labor Party, then I think they've got a chance of jagging it. But it is a tough seat, and it's not an easy one to overcome. Ken Wyatt is a very popular local MP, and popular in that kind of old school kind of way where people always kind of drop into his office or know that he's always around and available to help. And I give him credit for that. People really need permission out in Hasluck to vote against him. And I think the biggest kind of chain around the Liberal Party campaign in Hasluck is they've got a very unpopular Prime Minister. And so if Labor is able to make the case that Ken Wyatt is part of Scott Morrison's Liberal government and that therefore that means he is against Western Australia or, supported Palmer in the court case to try to bring down Western Australia's borders. I said Labor's borders, but that's also true. Then I think there's a chance of sort of jagging the seat. But let's just talk about Tanya Lawrence, the Labor candidate, who is a local, active, small business owner, bit of a policy wonk. She's done some work for the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and then she's also worked for Woodside. So she's got the truly Western Australian CV of you haven't been a Western Australian unless you've worked at Woodside. She's run previously for the Labor Party in a by-election in the seat of Darling Range, which is in the sort of similar demographic, but not necessarily, and broad geographic region, but not necessarily with a crossover on the seat of Hasluck. But she is a formidable candidate. She is very vivacious. She's smart. She's fantastic at thinking on her feet. She's energetic. I've watched her at events where she sort of brings the energy, creates a space for people to get conversational, get people talking, and I think she's would make a fantastic federal MP. The last time Labor held this seat was under Sharon Jackson, and it was lost in 2010, but won in 2007. I've got my years around the wrong way. It's got Midland, which is a densely populated city centre, and Ellenbrook, which I talked about before, smaller, a growing area, and new families, new migrant families, small homes, and lots of sort of small towns around, so a little few regional suburbs around the place. And it's a bit of and some of the towns in the electorate are a tree change, so Kalamunda, larger homes. It's where young families and older people are moving to kind of live out and just to get a bit of a change in scenery and a different way of a different place to live and grow, so grow their families. So I think because of the kind of change in the boundaries and the additional sort of smaller regional towns that are now part of that federal seat, it's probably got a little bit of a harder, road to climb to kind of to get it over the line. And with Ken running again, and the value of his incumbency, it makes a little bit of a challenge. But I do think that the campaign Labor's put in is quite formidable. They're doing a really good job out there. Tanya is fantastic, and I think there is a slim chance that on the night this one gets over the line, but I'm not prepared to call it just yet.
Fair enough. I sense you're going that way, but I mean, look, it is interesting because you're right. I mean, even from on the other side of the country, Ken White looks like a good bloke, and sometimes I actually sort of pity the guy because I feel like he's in the wrong party in some respects because certainly the work he's trying to do in terms of Aboriginal, Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander racial justice. I don't think he's getting a lot of love from the party he's in, but he just comes off like a reasonable kind of politician that wants to serve the public, and I guess that would go down very, very well in the electorate that he's in.
Yeah, absolutely.
But at the same time, he's got some challenges because he's got a dickhead of a boss, and a lot of people know that, and also some of the with the redistribution and creating new areas, there's an unfamiliarity to who the local member is, and there's an opportunity to sort of get in there. But also looking at the margin, it's getting a little. It seems like a bit of a gap, doesn't it? 5.9, almost 6%. But as you said before at the start of the podcast, it swings on. Yeah,
that's right. And and with an incumbent, so makes it a little bit harder, a little bit different to Pierce.
Yeah, and that sophomore swing probably comes in there as well. Although, how long has he been the member for, Pierce?
2010.
Okay, no, right. Okay, well, that's time for change. Okay, well, we'll put that one in the too hard basket for the moment, or just a watch and see for folks out there. Now, we're going to talk about two other seats that you're interested in that we think that, if things are going well for Labor. Oh, actually, sorry, I should say the odds for Hasluck. Ken White's $1.75. Tanya Lawrence is $2. So, interesting there. It's close. And then the last seat we just want to have a quick look at is a potential Teal's independent interesting race in the seat of Curtin.
Yes, that's right. I find this whole Teal independent thing interesting. Again, we could probably unpack that on a whole separate episode. But there was so let's talk about Curtin. The seat was held by Julie Bishop since 1998. It's generally always been a Liberal-held seat, except for the one time that the Liberal MP became an independent, but, 6 and 1/2 a dozen in the other. Celia Hammond, former, is the MP for the seat now. She's a former Vice-Chancellor of Notre Dame University, has been outspoken some controversial views in the past. The Labor candidate is a guy named Yannick Spencer, who is works at a management consulting firm and a local. And then there's the independent who's running, whose name is Kate Cheney. Cheney obviously being a good, strong family name in Western Australia and former senior local government representatives or elected representatives and former federal MPs as well. So she comes from good pedigree in that sense and understands politics, so no doubt would have had conversations around the dinner table. She's running a really well-resourced campaign. She's just to a bit more on her. She hails from a Boston consulting group background and also worked for Wesfarmers. And so her campaign is very well resourced, and you could tell when you drive around the electorate of Curtin, there's a bit of a war of the signs, and you can see that there's a lot of focus going in from both the Liberal Party and the Independent in the seat. It is a blue ribbon seat. It is the only federal seat which has, there is one in the southwest region, but let's just say it like this: it is the only federal seat in the metro area which has a state Liberal held seat in it, and that was the seat of Cottesloe, which, despite every seat falling in 2021, it held. And I think there should be a thorough investigation into that to work out why the Labor Party let that one slip. But I think that gives you an indication that there is a more loyalty to the party affiliation in that area than anywhere else in the metro area. It's got what's known as the Golden Triangle of suburbs, so very wealthy, very very large homes, the kind of demographic that lives around the foreshore of the Swan River in Claremont, Peppermint Grove, and Cottesloe, and adjacent also to the ocean. So it's just
it's old money, I assume, as well.
That's what I'm trying to say. Yes, thanks. And Labor's current. So there was a poll in the paper the other day, which said that the primary for the Liberal MP Hammond is at 42, the primary for Kate Cheney is at 24, and the primary for the Labor candidate is at 20. And somehow that got magicked up into a 2PP of 51-49 to the Liberal Party. So there's a bit of a vibe here that it's a potential one to watch for the independent. But that being said, I think at a primary of 42, you're pretty safe as houses in a seat like that. And I think that also there is a risk, if anything, that the Labor candidate doesn't poll third. And so I looked back at the previous primaries, and while 2019, 2016 and 2013 and 2010, Labor's never polled particularly highly against a Liberal MP. In 2007, when in theory there was a bit of a swing on and a mood for change towards Labor, Labor actually got a primary of 24.5 in that seat. And I think that the circumstances of the 2007 election might have a bit of the same vibe of now. A bit of a anti-PM sentiment, a bit of a move for change, and a need for a bit of fresh thinking. And I think that there's actually a risk that Labor polls second and not third, and then compromises the ability for the independent to win the seat. That being said, on a primary of 42, I struggle to see how anyone overcomes the Liberal MP. So you'll hear a lot, I think, about Curtin as a potential Teal independent pickup, but I actually look at it and go, I can't see a way that Hammond loses on a primary of 42.
Okay, that's interesting. Look, so in summary, we're calling Labor's going to hold the seat of our lease seat, which is the seat of Cowan. Sorry, my brain just went blank there. And we'll hopefully looking to pick up Swan and Pearce, and Hasluck's a bit of in the maybe category, but just keep an eye on some of those other ones for a bit of fun on election night.
Yeah, if the swing's on.
Indeed.
That's right.
Lenda, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Wonderful to see you again. What are your plans on election day? Where are you going to be hanging out?
I'm in the seat of Cowan and the seat of Perth. Looking forward to helping out my friend Patrick Gorman, who was the state secretary when I was assistant secretary. It's actually really exciting to be living in a federal Labor seat now, so we get to have his poster up on our yard. I've had the very important role at this election of guarding his bus stop sign. He's which I make sure has got no graffiti on it every day when I catch the bus to work. So I'm pretty stoked about living in a Labor seat, and I can't wait to be helping out Patrick and Anne Ali and Cowan on the day.
Fantastic. Fingers crossed we get a result on election night. And of course, you're 7 or 8 hours behind East Coast time, so we'll find out the results of how things go in WA probably Thursday afternoon after the election.
That's
but
right.
nonetheless, we hopefully, based on our numbers here, you're going to bring it home for us, so no pressure.
Well, there was that in 2019, as I was ripping down signs from a polling booth in Chewett Hill, and I started getting these text messages from people saying, over to you, WA, at 6 p.m. our time. I thought, oh, geez, we must not be getting there if everybody's sort of looking over at Western Australia to get over the line. But I think if we could see seats go to Labor in New South Wales and a few of those others in sort of Victoria and South Australia, and keeping an eye on Tassie, and hopefully picking up a few seats in Queensland, then I think we are capable of bringing it home, but I'm not sure we're capable of bringing everything to get us over the line.
I know, indeed. We'll find out. Hopefully, as you said, hopefully it's done and dusted by the time we have to look to Western Australia for those couple of seats that we talked about today. All right, Lenda, be well.
Thank you.
Okay, we are in the final straight, the final quarter of this monster podcast, the final state in our analysis of the path to 76, and it's the Florida of Australian politics, the Sunshine State, Queensland. And to help me break that down is a former ALP national organiser and now the member for Logan in the Queensland Parliament. He's been on the show before. Great to welcome him back. Linus Power, how are you doing?
Well, nervous as always before elections. I'm always a bit of a pessimist, but slowly I'm beginning to creep with confidence because the Liberals are beginning to look more and more desperate, which encourages me.
Queensland. So I'll give you an update, Linus, of where we're up to. So we've already spoken to Elliot Stein in New South Wales. We've spoken to David Feeney about Victoria, Tasmania and South Australia. And we've spoken to an old colleague of ours, Lenda Oshalem in WA. And the seats, so Labor needs to pick up 7 seats to form government in the lower house. The seats that we think that we're going to win, if I go through it by state, in New South Wales, Reid and Bennelong are the 2 seats that we think will jag. Boothby in South Australia, we're feeling bullish about that. Chisholm in Victoria. I'm parking Higgins. I got really excited about Higgins, and I'm just going to park that for the time being, but I could change my mind throughout the week. In Tasmania, David and I couldn't agree on what seat we were going to pick up, Brass or Baden. He'd heard things that said that we were going to win Bass. I'd heard things we were going to win Braddon. As I think about it more and more, we could possibly not win anything in Tasmania, and it stays pat. Maybe we jag 1. So let's for the sake of an argument, let's give us 1 there. And then in WA, Swan and Pearce are the seats that we actually feel good about. Hasluck probably we might think it might be a stretch too far. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 if we get a Tasmanian seat. So as you can see, we're setting it up for you, Linus. It is super, super close. Queensland, do not let us down. Where are we? How are we feeling about Queensland? And before we sort of move into the seats that we want to win, let's talk about the seats that we need to hold. And I want to start with a good friend of yours and mine. She's also been on the pod a couple of times as well, Terry Butler in the seat of Griffith. How are we feeling about Griffith?
Yeah, I've always felt pretty good about Griffith. Terry's a great local member, a hard fighter. This is one of those things where you see what we've seen in this election is this real opening up of LNP seats who felt the LNP hadn't done enough, which could have been a huge opportunity of the Greens. But instead, they're obsessed with destroying people like Terry, who are fantastic arguments for the environment, for climate change, for social justice. They're obsessed with trying to attack Labor. Whereas they could have had much more opportunity in attacking in the seat of Brisbane or even in Ryan, but they've really put the effort into because they're obsessed with fantastically good communicators, young women who are passionate about their local community, who have so much to offer. The Greens actually want to target Labor in that way. But Terry, I think, and the local Southside campaign, shout out to the Greenslopes branch, I think that they've done a really strong campaign. They've focused on the fact that Labor has a really strong message about climate change that we've stuck to persistently, that we're funding health and education. And those things I think, will stand her in good stead. I'm beginning to feel more and more confident about that, despite what you might see Greens say on the internet.
I mean, to that point you just said before about that missed opportunity, look, and I don't want to talk about the Teals too much in this particular episode because we're trying to work out how Labor wins, not how independents get bums on seats. But if you're the Greens and you're doing a post-election analysis, you'd be asking yourselves, why the hell weren't we competitive in the seats where the Teals are potentially going to jag seats? Because that's actually where they should be going, because they're the type of voters that actually are the Greens base. But instead, it just illustrates their preoccupation the Greens have and their absolute blind hatred that they have of the Labor Party, that they can't look past the red seats,
Look, any honest analysis of a Greens campaign and looking where they put investment and where they put effort would be, why are we trying to hurt progressive parties who want to look after people, want to make change on the environment and want to hold a 50% coalition together? But the Greens really have an obsession with the Labor Party. We saw them take down the Deputy Premier of Queensland in the last state election, put huge amounts of effort into their and achieve nothing in terms of politics. Or improving Queensland. Any analysis would shut down the Greens. So I don't think they'll be taking that hard analysis, because the analysis would actually make them think that we're actually hurting the stated objectives we have.
Looking at the first preference votes by party going back to 2007, at the 2007 federal election, which obviously was a glorious election for Labor, the primary for Labor we won on primaries, it was 53%. The Greens primary then was 7.9. Then the 2010 primary election, the Greens primary lifted to 15 and Labor's dropped to 44. At the 2013, the Greens primary actually dropped back down to 10, but Labor's fell again to 40. At the 2016 election, the Greens primary lifted back up to 17. That was a high watermark. Labor fell to 33. And then at the last election, the Greens primary lifted to 23 and Labor's fell to 31. So you can actually, and the Liberal primary basically has been reasonably steady. So we can see a decline in the Labor's primary and a growth in the Greens primary. Going to this election, how are we seeking to address that? I mean, what are your thoughts on turning that around? Is it? Are we hoping for a national swing, like a national mood to change government, in which people then sort of go, okay, I need to give my vote back to Labor because that's the main game? Is Terry making good work on a local level to actually start to arrest that slide that she essentially inherited from Kevin Rudd? Or are some of the nuances within the climate change policy that Labor has announced in the lead up to this campaign probably going to help address that slide in our primary? I want to get your sense of what's the feeling on the ground there.
I mean, part of this is the generic weakness of Labor in Queensland, because like any federal seat, it might include West End, which is a very inner city, highly educated. But it's also got other areas where there's elderly people who are much more traditional Labor voters who are going to benefit from a lifted Labor primary altogether, where we're taking votes off the Liberals at this election. And there's that tension between being a Greens light and being a much more broader Labor. And I think Terry threads that well, because she's passionate about those issues, a great advocate for them. But also very much a Labor person and can appeal to people who are, in the seat of green slopes in commission housing. That's, you've got to get that tension right. And I think she's getting that right. And she'll lift the vote especially from taking votes off the Liberals, which is ultimately what we should be about.
The betting odds, Terry's $1.25. The Green candidate, Max Chandler Mather, who's the name, as we said before, is a name that's come straight out of Green's Central Casting, is $3.75. The Tories, $12. So the money suggests that it's a Labor hold. Do you support that view? Do you think Labor's going to hold the seat of Griffith?
Yeah, I don't bet on elections, but yeah, I do. I speaking to people on the ground, there's a quiet confidence growing that whatever threats were there, people want to be part of making this future with Terry, because she's such a passionate person about the local area and passionate about those issues that matter to people.
Fantastic. Okay, now let's turn our attention, if we can put Griffith down as a Labor hold, let's turn our attention to the seats that we need to pick up in Queensland. And just to sort of set the scene, I mean, there are 30 seats in Queensland. There are 39 seats in Victoria. I think Labor holds 6 or 5 seats in Queensland. Labor holds 24 in Victoria.
It's quite embarrassing for Queensland Labor. Having run the state government consistently since '89 with only a few interregnums, it is something where we can get this message right for Queensland. We are very different, but that doesn't mean we're anti-Labor. That's not built in. It's not baked in. We can get there, and I think there will be opportunities in government, because the LNP with incumbency can fearmonger so much that it makes it difficult, and they can't do that about the Queensland state government, who's there and real and has recent history. It is really tough for Queensland Labor people to know that we hold back federal Labor governments in Queensland. But I think it's not built in, it's not baked in. It can change over time.
Absolutely. And it just shows you, I mean, the last time we really had success in Queensland was the 07 campaign, and ever since then, it's been a real battle for you folks up there. And I point out those statistics not to embarrass people in Queensland, but just also to illustrate the enormity of the challenge that it is for Queensland Labor to just peg a couple of seats. But we've identified 3 particular seats that we think that we're a good chance in. And I want to stay in the suburbs of Brisbane for the time being. Let's cross the river and look at the federal seat of Brisbane, in which the incumbent is Trevor Evans. The seat is held by the Tories by 4.9, so just almost 5%. The Labor candidate's Madonna Jarrett, but also the Greens are running as well, a guy called Stephen Bates. Talk us through your thoughts about Brisbane.
Yeah, I think all of these seats are tough. All the ones I'm talking about, I'm not going to be able to tell you. It's a bit like the Bass-Braddon thing. I think there will be a win, but where they are I'm not absolutely clear. So I think that Brisbane is a really good chance. It's the inner city seat of Brisbane. Remembering that Brisbane is not like Melbourne and Sydney with a massive banking eastern suburbs. We're a bit more of like a very, very big country town. Madonna Jarrett's a fantastic, both old school and new school candidate. She's part of that Labor tradition in that area, but also works for Deloitte and really in their risk assessment, so knows about policy coming in from the future. Trevor Evans, I think people locally had hope about him, that he would help change the LNP, but really he's been a party line Canberra Morrison guy for the most part, and hasn't, unlike some MPs who tried to distinguish themselves from the LNP, hasn't changed on that. Again, just reflecting back on the sort of Teal vote kind of thing, is that where there is no Teal candidate, obviously they made a chance choice not to target Brisbane. The Teal vote is for the most part going to Labor. This is people who have voted Liberal in the past, but are educated people who are thinking through some of the future challenges we've got, and that they're to some extent coming to Labor, and that's what's really encouraging about this seat, because they might have put their trust in Trevor Evans because he told them he'd be a new type of Liberal. He really hasn't been. He's been the Canberra line, the Morrison line guy, which has been a bit of a disappointment, I think.
For us Southerners to understand Queensland politics, is it fair, and the diversity of the state throughout the geography of the huge, massive land that Queensland is the Griffith and Brisbane seats kind of the closest thing that we can equate to that inner city, Sydney, Melbourne kind of vibe, or is even Brisbane still very inherently Queensland as well? Like I'm just trying to work out in terms of looking where if we can see a national trend of educated, middle class voters that have maybe traditionally voted Liberal, but are socially progressive, have sort of looked at the Liberal Party and said, "Enough, I'm done with that." And now they're looking to where can they cast their vote now? Are those 2 seats opportunities in which, well, let's focus on Brisbane. Is that a seat where there is an opportunity for Labor to say, "Hey, you should come home to us," because actually we are the party that kind of aligns with your values? Is that what is that? Because I think that's what's happening in Victoria. I think if we win Higgins, it's recasting the way that voters look at the Liberal Party. And Elliot talked about this at the start of the podcast, which was, Morrison has basically said, stuff our blue blood wealthy base. We are going to try and grab out of suburban and rural voters, and that's who we're going to become. Kind of like this sort of Nixon moment in the Republican Party. What's your thoughts about that in terms of Brisbane?
Oh, look, I see that going on nationally. One of the things about Brisbane is, as I said, it doesn't have the kind of institutional wealth and intergenerational institutional wealth. And it's just not as big. So Ryan, in some ways, is more of that wealth for a start. And look, there are pockets of Brisbane, like Ascot, that probably represent that. But it's not just suburb after suburb after suburb. And it's different in that way, in that it's a bit of more of a broader, more representative of the entirety of Brisbane in both Griffith and Brisbane itself. So there are aspects of that, but not nearly as strongly. The other thing about Brisbane is that we tend to be not an east versus west suburb, because remember, the richest part's in the west, but Hilltop and those sorts of suburbs surrounded by the valleys, which are much more traditionally working class, with a lot of gentrification going on. So we have pockets of really wealthy areas that are surrounded by areas less so, and there's less of that east-west divide. So the geography of the city makes those two seats quite different. So yeah, in essence, there are suburb by suburb those dynamics going on, but both Brisbane and Griffith are different than that.
So how are we feeling about Brisbane then? I mean, it appears certainly with the betting odds, Trevor Evans is $1.85. Madonna Jarrett, Labor's candidate, is $3. Stephen Bates, the Greens, is $4.70. Are we feeling good about Brisbane? Because if we're feeling good about Brisbane, then ALP at $3 is actually a good bet to take. But are we looking at that and saying, shit, this is still this? I mean, it's still 8 days to go, right? We're not. The election's still alive. Things can change. But how are we feeling about Brisbane?
I think it's a better than 1 in 3 chance. And I think we're closing well, and Morrison's beginning to apologise for himself. And I don't think that works. So I think we're a better than 1 in 3 chance. But I wouldn't put it in the 1 category. So look, my granddad was a greyhound and thoroughbred trainer. He'd probably be putting money on it, but not with the expectation of winning, but no, it would be splitting his bets, and it's better than the odds show. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yes, it makes perfect sense. And I know all the gamblers that listen to this podcast will be going, oh, right, okay, gotcha, Linus. Okay, no, good. Yeah, that's super helpful. Okay, let's park Brisbane for a moment. Why don't we look at these states in entirety? Let's move to, Longman next?
So
just 3.3%.
Yeah, Longman's based basically around Caboolture, Bribie Island. So the very, very far outer north of Brisbane, on the road heading north. So at the last state election, we saw a really extraordinary swings where especially elderly people, like on Bribie, who had been a real stalwarts of the LNP, swung really, really strongly to the Labor Party. And that was about the fact that we had a protective, conservative, careful message about COVID and about the strength and economy of the state, and really swept the rug out from the LNP. And we saw some actual strong movement of people who had either maybe been Labor voters during their working lives, but had changed to be Liberal voters as the world's moving faster for them, and came to Labor. So the question is, how much of that vote can we keep from the state election? Because the state, it's a lot of Labor state members in the area, and they did very, very well and had really strong swings. We saw Rebecca Fanning, who's the Labor candidate, a former health advisor, fantastic person. She showed her credentials where you had the Sky News debate, where effectively it was Sky News and the LNP ganging up on Rebecca, and she simply smashed them. Controlled, knowledgeable, and really focused on what these issues mean for people in Caboolture and Bribie Island and those areas. So I think that if anyone goes and watches that, you're going to absolutely see what a fantastic candidate she'd be, and what a great contribution she'd make, and how she'd be a passionate, advocate for the Longman area. This is an unusual one in that, do you remember the by-election we had? So we had the by-election. We won this the previous election to 2019. We had the unfortunate thing of historical British citizenship that was not known, and then had a by-election which we managed to win with Susan Lamb. Then we went into 2019 and lost it, but there's only a 3.3% margin. We've got a very strong candidate. Terry Young looks out of his depth, even though he is the incumbent member, though only relatively short time. What I was speaking to an organiser on the ground, he was telling me that they are focused on both the seniors in Bribie Island, not possibly to win them in the way we did in the state election, but to get a better swing, with the restoration of the urgent care clinic that was cut by the LNP, plus also getting more GPs in the area, because that's a big issue. And then also focusing, so that's also, those two are both also family issues, but also focusing on the cost of living issue, because there's lots of tradies who live in Caloundra who are building houses in the growing area. So his feeling was that the focus on cost of living and the Liberals' indifference to low-wage workers getting an extra $1, and Albanese's, Anthony's really clear message about that we're on the side of workers, including those tradies. I think the message getting through. We're beginning to feel more confident about it. So we need a good finish for this week, and we could go over the line there, but not easy.
The other thing to add a complication to this scenario is the primary votes that will be attributed to minor parties. One of the biggest concerns I think we have, broadly speaking, is looking at the published polls anyway, that the primary votes that have been attributed to One Nation and to Palmer, and also just other, the where all these, I still want to know where the F is, all these other, which is a huge number, sitting around about 10%. Where is that going to go? Where are those preferences going to go? And looking at the 2019 preference flows, when you redistributed One Nation, Greens, United, all those kind of people, the total of non-Labor Liberal preferences was 27% in the seat of Longman. 66% of the One Nation preferences went to the Tories. 77% of the preferences for the Greens went to Labor, which stacks up, it normally is around about 75 to 80%. Palmer, 64% of their preferences went to the Tories. Fraser Anning was running, but he picked up 2%. That vote there will go somewhere, but that was 70% of his votes went to the Tories. Strong connection there between Nazis and the Liberal Party. So this is a concern for us. What are your feelings going into the final week about this situation with where the F are these preferences going to go? Can we peel them off to actually put a number one next to Labor? Clearly, people hate Morrison. I think that's the thematic we're picking up across this campaign. Everywhere, up and down the country, people hate Morrison. But where is their preferences going to go when they vote on election day?
Well, I mean, we're the kings of other in Queensland. We give birth to them. We try and send them down south, and they.
You really do, actually. That's a very good point, Linus.
And look, one of the things is to compare the message that we had last time from these others, which firstly had big money and they had big voices. Last time it was really consistently gunned and directly aimed at Labor. And the message was that Bill Shorten's taxes are a threat to your family. And they were really articulate and clear about it and had huge amounts of money. This time, the message is a lot more confused. We've seen the One Nation sort of get into fights with the LNP about where they're preferencing and what they're doing. They've also dropped away a fair bit. They haven't had that clear message. Palmer has been absolutely clear, freedom, freedom, freedom. But for what that means is a bit of a test to what you want it to mean. And for many people, they're seeing that government as personified by Morrison, who's a bit of a bulldozer, as he's already explained. Some people say a lot stronger things than that, but the direction of fire is a lot more scattered, let's put it that way. So if you're a Palmer voter, you're not going to be someone who loves Labor, but you don't love politics, you don't love mainstream politics whatsoever. So the message is the message and task that Palmer's giving to people and sending to people is not stop Bill Shorten. It's a lot more complex than that, and not easy to sum up. And so I think that that presents less of a really a strong danger, but also less of a danger in that. And you've got to understand is Palmer, like I imagine he spends a fair bit in Melbourne and Sydney, but the amount he spends in Queensland is extraordinary. Every billboard and every piece of ads and front pages and specials in the Courier Mail and things like that. It's really extraordinary how much money he spends in Queensland as a proportion. It's really quite extraordinary. But his message this time has been a lot less clear.
So, in summary, for Longman, in terms of
if we run clearly home on our urgent care clinic, more GPs, and Morrison's failings of the cost of living, I feel positive about this. And look, ring up the Rebecca Fanning campaign if you're in Melbourne and volunteer to call, because you've got a really clear message about those three things. Google them now, ring them up, and ask to say, I want to make some calls to support Rebecca. I've just seen her on Sky Debate. She was absolutely fantastic. And they'll know exactly what you're talking about, and they'll give you some numbers to call. If you can be passionate about the fact that an outer suburban area needs urgent care clinics, needs more GPs, and we need that focus of cost of living and decent wages for people who are working really hard in lots of building and construction industries.
Here. And that's something to point out as well. I mean, we're making decisions or making predictions about seats that these are just predictions. These are we're speaking to people like Linus who have got insights on the ground to get a sense of what it will look like on election day. But as we speak, we should also be cognizant of the fact that this election is still alive. These seats are still up for grabs. So get on the phones if you're not in a marginal seat. And if you are in a marginal seat, then get on those doors and have a chat to some targeted, undecided or persuadable voters and actually win this thing for Labor. The betting odds for Longman, Rebecca Fanning's $1.82, Terry Young, the incumbent Liberal, is $1.90. I mean, that really just shows you how close a race it really is with those numbers.
That's a flip of a coin, and it also shows you that coming home with the right message is going to be the candidate that wins.
Yep, definitely. All right. Last seat to look at is the seat of Leichhardt. Let's head up north into far north Queensland and not northern Queensland. I made that mistake when I went and campaigned in Cairns and got that pointed out to me very, very quickly on day one, thank God, because I was there for 3 weeks. Talk us through Leichhardt.
Yeah, well, you pointed out that it is far north Queensland and very different from Townsville in North Queensland and Mackay to some extent. All of these cities have their own character. One of the things that people don't think, because they think of those coastal cities as sort of, and even Brisbane as an amorphous mass, is that Cairns and the Cape are very different from Queensland. The Cape, of course, has these huge Aboriginal populations. And Cairns, we talk about Gladstone or Townsville or Mackay as sort of industry towns based on one industry. Cairns is an industry town, but its industry is based on the environment. People come from all over the world, making it a much more international place because of the nature of the Cairns environment, whether that's the Daintree, the new walks that are going in, the tablelands even, but especially the reef. So it creates a different character of community in Cairns. And people shouldn't underestimate that Queensland has a lot of diversity in those places. It's also one where, look, Warren Entsch, we all remember famously that he retired in 2007 and then his candidate lost and then he came back. But each progressive election, he seems less and less interested. And you also feel that he bears Morrison through real gritted teeth. So he's there, they begged him to be there. He probably doesn't want to be there and is putting less and less effort into it. On the other hand, a lot of faith ran last time and lost. And I think it was one of those things is losing an election is never good. I know that personally, but it's a learning experience where you think, how could I have got those extra votes? How do I focus more on what people actually want? And I think she's a stronger candidate this time. Look, I called a bloke whom I know really well, a strong Labor supporter, but he's got very close ties into business. And he said that he thinks the movement's on because he's listening to business people who are reaching out to him to say, oh, how do I meet with her? How do I? And they're in those relatively small communities. Brisbane's a small country, a big country town. Cairns is one where people are interconnected. and they're beginning to feel that the movement's on and that things are shifting there. So, look, yeah, from speaking to locals, they're extremely positive. One of the difficulties is I'm closer sitting here on the south side of Brisbane to Melbourne than I am to the CBD of Cairns. So remembering that you wouldn't take me on any authority speaking about what's happening in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, but because I'm technically in the boundaries of Queensland, I can have a view on Leichhardt and the Cape. So that's the other thing to remember is how different these communities are. But speaking to locals, there's a real feeling of positivity that they're giving Light a second look, but also that inch is fading, and there's some positivity about that as well.
When I was up in Far North Queensland working on the campaign in 2012, the state election campaign in 2012.
You remember, FNQ is very different from the suburb of Far Q. That's the difference.
Yeah, exactly. Near Q and Far Q. That's right. Just while since I've done that gag, the working on the 2012 state election campaign, which obviously wasn't a happy hunting ground for yours truly there, Linus. But the thing that I took away from being in Cairns was the amount of anger and resentment from people who were connected to the tourism industry, tourism operators. To your point about working on in the tablelands and in the forests, plus the reef itself, they were lamenting the fact that a lot of people weren't coming into Cairns from overseas, and it was really, really hurting their bottom line. And they were saying we need more government support to prop up this industry because it's basically this is the biggest show in town. And hearing you then say, talking to folks on the ground now who are in that same community, saying there is a mood on and people want to talk to Labor, that bodes well, because that was the underlying thing that was hurting us at the time in 2012. I thought that this was baked in, so to speak, that people were just generally disappointed with the state Labor government at that moment. And we lost Cairns, the seat of Cairns, for the first time ever. Poor old Kirsten Lassima, she ran a great campaign, but people weren't listening. And Barwon River went as well, another great Labor candidate. People just got lost in that wash. So I'm hoping from what I'm hearing from you that that community up there have turned off the Libs and are now starting to turn their attention to Labor and hopefully park their vote with us and turn things around for them. Because I'm imagining, what was the experience like up there with COVID? Did they experience some form of lockdown? They must have experienced some, like the fact that people couldn't come to this country because of the border restrictions. And I'm not making an argument for or against that, but there would be some level of anger towards the government for doing that, because that would have hit the bottom line of those tourist operators in Cairns, right?
Yeah, there was. I think people had an understanding that, and they didn't want in their community people coming in from overseas. They weren't prepared to do that risk. You also got to remember that because Victorians and Melbourne and Sydney people were prevented from going overseas, when the borders were open, they rushed to Cairns. And I encourage everyone to start planning this afternoon for a post-election trip in winter to Cairns, the best time. Fantastic place. So those Queensland shutdowns affected them as much. And I think there was real understanding, but there was some sort of tiredness about it. However, what was frustrating was when Victoria and Sydney went into a complete shutdown and weren't letting anyone travel whatsoever, there was financial help for Melbourne and Sydney, but none for a place like Cairns that was absolutely dependent. And not only, if they'd said it sort of politely, look, we've got struggles and you've got to recognise that Melbourne and Sydney are going through a lot more. If they'd said, and what we'll do is do a package to get Brisbane people up to Cairns. If they'd said that sympathetically, but there was kind of an indifference to the plight. And you've got to remember, in tourism, there's a lot of working class people who, it's not all big developers and things like that. These are a lot of industries that are based on people providing services, whether restaurants or tours or all sorts of things like that. And they just felt, well, you don't really care about us. So it was more that last bit, because I think the people had a pretty good understanding about international and border closures. But when, Victoria and New South Wales went into those extensive lockdowns, and more people that were indifferent at the federal level to what Cairns was facing.
So there you go, folks. We've come to the end of this monster podcast. We've been right across the country and we've tried to find a path to victory. And I think the wash up is that we feel confident about 6 seats, and then we've probably got 4 to 5 seats that we are not entirely sure about, and that's the 2 in Tasmania and the 3 that we've just talked about today. So right now, as it stands, we are 1 seat short of government with 4, maybe 5 seats that, there's still a bit of work to be done. So the take-home message there is that there's, a week to go on this campaign. We're in the final week. People are still voting. The Australian election study research, which they do every election cycle, bears out that 27% of voters make up their mind on the final week, 14% of them make up their mind on election day itself. People are still deciding whether or not they're going to vote Labor or Liberal, and the only way that we can have any influence on that is by speaking directly to those voters. And you can do that on the phones or on the doors. The national field program that the Labor Party runs is a weapon for us. It is far stronger than the Tories. The Tories basically are going to be relying on digital ads and TV ads and up until Wednesday night, because then the blackout comes in, and then there's basically going to need the front pages of all the Tory magazines to run their headlines all the way to election day. So our weapon is to get out there actually and have meaningful, values-based conversations with undecided or persuadable voters in marginal seats. And we've just listed off those marginal seats. So Reid, Bennelong, Boothby, Chisholm, Higgins, Bass, Swan, Pearce, Longman, Leichhardt and Brisbane. They're the seats that we need to be focusing our energies on. They're the seats we need to flip to form government and win those 76 votes. So get out there and make a call or knock on a door. And you can do that if you're in Victoria. Go to thisislabor.org and put down your details, and a field organiser will give you a call this week. And if you're outside of Victoria, go to the national page, which is alp.org.au. And then someone will give you a call as well. And as Linus just pointed out, Rebecca Fanning, just jump on her Facebook page, I reckon, or maybe her website, and put in their details. And I reckon a field organiser will give you a call and give you some scripts if you're outside of Brisbane to make some calls into that electorate and talk about why it's so critical that you vote Labor at this election. To all of our people who have come on the show this week for this podcast, Elliot Stein from Hawker Britain, Lenda Oshalem from Seek Newgate, David Feeney from David Feeney, and Linus Power, the member for Logan. Thank you to all of you guys for coming on the show and being courageous and brave and putting your careers on the line by actually making some predictions, which is not easy to do. A lot of people don't like to do that. They like to Monday quarterback and say, I told you so. But these people came on the show and actually did it, and it's been recorded. We really appreciate your insights. We hope this has been super helpful to all of our listeners out there for this monster podcast. And thanks for sticking with us. And it will give you some insight about what the seats are that you need to pay attention to on election day. We've got our final episode with David Feeney and Emma Dawson. It'll be up Thursday night this week. We normally put them up on Friday morning. We're going to record it Thursday, Arvo, but we'll get it up as soon as we possibly can, so you've got time to listen to it before election day. And then obviously make sure you go out and hand out on election day at your local booth. Make calls, knock doors, and hopefully we can bring this thing home. Linus Power, thank you so much for coming on the show. What's your plans on election day? Where are you going to be?
I'll be in with my great mate Jim at the Regent's Park booth, but then also doing some stuff in Ford in the with the hard work that the Ford campaign's doing with Rowan. And I'm looking forward to a really good result. I'm beginning to feel more confident as we go forward.
Fantastic. Thanks, guys. And we'll see you all on Thursday night. Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.